Hi, I'm Keegan. This is A Bunch of Gamers, and this is the first GM's talk in, I think, 2 years? So, welcome back to all three of you who are waiting to hear my thoughts on things. I have with me James Sambrano, writer for several books you're probably familiar with, such as books from Mage, The Apocalyptic Record, and who had released an article about his mistreatment from Paradox, which I will link in the description of this video, and then Josh from High Level Games and the illustrious Werewolf the podcast. Though he can't listen to my podcast, he's finally come on another episode of this one, so welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keegan. It's always a good call out for me for not listening to your podcast. To be fair, I listen to all the GM talks. I don't listen to all the game episodes. I'm so sorry.
With the stellar reviews of Longer Than the Bible, I don't understand why you wouldn't. Anyway, we're here to talk about...
I don't listen to any podcast that I'm not in, so I can't really hold it against Josh.
No. So we're here to talk about Werewolf 5th. We're going to be sharing our thoughts. We're going to just kind of go through things. James is going to probably fill in some gaps, such as things that he has written for in the book, and as well as his experiences related to the book, of course. And, preamble, of course, being that if you like this book, more power to you. If you didn't know the situation because you're not chronically online or not close to the situation, I get it. But we will probably not be kind to a lot of creators of this book, and I can guarantee we will not be kind to this book. And if that makes you feel attacked, it's not intended to. And if you cannot separate that, just don't listen to this episode. I get it. Or leave an angry comment and up my engagements. That's fine, too.
The only thing I'm going to add to that, Keegan, is there are a couple of people who did write on this, who are writers on this book, who I appreciate. And I've probably reached out to you directly already to say, hey, I don't dislike what you put into this book. I have many thoughts about why things are bad in this book, but I want to say that to those folks in particular, that I love you. And I know sometimes you take a job for the paycheck, and I don't necessarily begrudge you that.
Yeah,
I'd also add, having been an author on the previous iteration of this book, that I understand what it was like to be in the position of author against maybe against is a hostile word, but whatever, against the views of the brand director. And so for me, coming from that perspective, it's really hard for me to feel any kind of bad feelings towards the authors, period. I don't have any bad feelings towards the authors. I do obviously have some uncomfortable feelings towards Kareem Umar and how he chooses to conduct himself as a brand editor, as well as that broader vision and what it's given us in the final project.
And that is fair. I should say not necessarily individual authors, but I guess I should say the developer, or one of the developers specifically, or how this book was developed, and that was a miss on my part.
I've also personally never had any interaction other than brief comments on Discord with Justin, so I don't know.
Okay.
I don't have any opinions one way or the other. I'm sure someone else might, but I don't.
Sure. Yeah, no. And yeah, so I should say more angry at systemic issues within the company, but there are certain people who are more of the face of those issues than others.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair.
So with that, let's get into it. We're just going to go by this chapter by chapter, and I'm going to say right now that when I read the first paragraph of the first chapter, I was just like, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I like this book, because the first chapter, I feel, went real fucking hard in a good way. At least initially, the first paragraph where it's just like, hey, all this shit's happening, sometimes violence is the answer to this, to the people fucking you over and fucking over the world and all that, and you're just like, god damn, yes, this is exactly how a werewolf book should open. Any thoughts from both of you?
I don't disagree with you, but I do want to say that was one of my first kind of oh, I see where this is going kind of moments at the same time, because the quote you mentioned about violence being righteous also has in parentheses the word almost always in there. And
that's
right
fair.
away I was like, okay, that's someone's coming in with some alternative views on here that are trying to say what's wrong with what the Guru are doing, and not that there isn't reason to question that because it's always been the case, but like right in the first paragraph, it's like maybe you're not doing the right thing, and as we're gonna get into, it's like ramped up in the rest of the book. So
Yeah.
Yep. I agree with that, and I want to actually quote the line directly. It says, "And that violence is, in brackets, almost always righteous, if only subjectively." And that weaseliness of the wording is one of the problems throughout this book.
Yes. Agreed.
I also want to talk about the use of animism, because they start off here by telling us about animism. And James, please jump in and correct me if you feel I'm misrepresenting any of this. But my personal interpretation of the animism of Werewolf the Apocalypse is much more a platonic animism rather than anything that is reflective of what I would consider a more accurate animism from any cultures that I'm familiar with around the world. Being that there is a supernatural world of forms, spirits within that world of forms are the perfect versions of the things that exist in reality. That is, I suppose, animistic in some ways, but it is a very specific lens that Werewolf has always had, and I think in some ways it just feels a little strange the way they've done that here too. But I guess we can get into that as we go through it.
Yeah. Moving on, we've got, the various takes, the Garu not being part of one world or the other, which was kind of in previous editions. It's not immediately obvious in this intro chapter, I feel. It is very, very, ramped up in this edition to the point where, the Umbra hurts the Guru, which I thought was certainly a choice.
when we had our version of the book, the idea from the outset that was being handed to us was that they wanted to essentially, I wouldn't say entirely remove Umbra from play, but definitely bring it back. Like it didn't present a way for them to go forward with the street level play in the way that they wanted. They also saw the Guru's access to the Umbra as being just when you do cross splat play as being just too powerful, and so they wanted a way to limit that so that Guru couldn't assassinate vampire princes, for example, just by popping out of the Umbra and then popping back in. Which, I don't want to do too much addition comparison here, but I would point out that didn't really make sense to me when it came down to us, because if you look at all the rules of how it used to what it used to require to step back and forth through the gauntlet, that would have gotten you killed so easily, doing something as ridiculous as that. Guru should know better, unless they're a rank 4 older brother with certain gifts. That's about it. that choice, from what I understood, was more about just bringing it down to the street level play, which is part of their broader goal.
Yeah, that kind of tracks, because it does seem like with especially Kareem and Justin, they were big vampire people. And so they were bringing a lot of vampire energy to Werewolf and not understanding how different of games they were. A lot of what they try to quote-unquote fix in this edition are fixes from people who have a misconception of Werewolf from being on the other side. And part of it, I think, was some of it was with LARP, because I've heard LARPers say that popping out of the Umbra was actually much easier. And so that Prince strategy was at least semi-viable in the LARP, but you shouldn't be designing a tabletop game on your shitty LARP experience. Just my personal thought. And
I think exactly that, right? I think exactly that. You shouldn't design a tabletop game based on your experiences in LARP, because yes, I did that as a Garu player a couple of times, assassinate a prince in exactly that way. It was possible. It's less easy to get stuck in the gauntlet in the LARP version, but that's no reason to do this to the game.
The thing I just might bring up about what the decision making around the Umbra being hostile is, for people who've been World Darkness fans for a long, long time now. Some of us might recall, particularly mage fans, that when Revised came out, they did a similar tactic, and it was for the same reason. Revised Mage was meant to be more of a street level game, and they created an in-game plot called the Avatar Storm, which made it so that crossing the gauntlet was extremely hostile, and people could get killed doing so, especially if they were more powerful mages. However, the fan response to that was extremely negative. It to this, even if you weren't a fan back then, if you're in the mage community, you will hear people complaining about that particular change, and it was kind of, it's up to the decision of the storytellers, but Seder Bricado, who is the author of Mage 20th, kind of intentionally created options where you could take that back or pretend it was over because people were so upset about the impact that had on the setting.
Yeah, and I think it's a because this whole game is, especially this edition at least, in the text, I don't agree so much in the subtext, but the text of this game is much more inclined to climate change bad. This game is about climate change, like the worm is empowered by climate change. And as we all know, street level action is how you deal with a systemic issue of climate change. And so I don't think street level really works for Werewolf, and especially how they've written this edition.
Yeah, I think you're both right on both of those things, right? That the Avatar Storm, people hated, people still hate, people get flip chairs over that. And doing that here, if you're a Legacy fan, which they've already said they don't care about Legacy fans, but if you're a Legacy fan, that's going to be a thing that's going to frustrate you. You can ignore it to some degree, but it's a thing that's there in the text, right? So you're always going to have to work around it. And I want to talk about something different that they start mentioning here. It's that Eru, right, are trying to write their own legend. And I don't dislike that. I actually really like the way they write that particular bit. But then throughout the book, you get a sense that they don't value oral tradition, and that the writers or a significant whomever, someone involved in the development of this book, views oral tradition as unreliable, and if not unreliable, something that makes things get lost easily. I would argue that is not true about oral tradition, right? That it does not tend to lose things, right? Does not tend to lose information about things that have happened in the past to people. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. I'll use the kind words.
Okay, I was gonna say you could say Western, like I'm okay with that.
That's what I was gonna say. I actually find the way that they talk about oral tradition in this book to be, honestly, I find it insulting, because obviously there are lots of different groups across the world, different cultural groups that use oral tradition as a form of history keeping, but it's extremely common amongst indigenous people. And as I've, people will argue with me about this, but I think I'm right that a lot of the foundations of the setting of Werewolf the Apocalypse is set in at least a new agey Western view of what indigenous cultures are.
Yep.
And so by kind of reversing the fact that, historically, again, try not to do comparisons, but in previous editions, this was the way the Guru kept their histories, and they did a good job of it. They have an entire auspice dedicating to doing that job. And so throughout this book, I feel like it's not only insulting to where the original setting ideas were, stolen from, to be honest, but it's I'm going to steal them and also say they're terrible. But on top of that, I think that's why when you look at when we get down later to the tribes section, we start looking at the archetypes. You'll see archetypes that are obviously meant to be galliards that are like SoundCloud rapper, which I think just completely misses what the theme of those auspices is supposed to be, because they've set this kind of Western chauvinistic view of non-Western ways of history keeping, i.e. written history, are inferior and not worthy of respect.
Yeah, and I want to say it was was it Aristotle? It was one of the Greeks who went on a rant that they recorded in writing, hilariously, that he's like, the written word is terrible. People forget shit all the time now that they can write it down. And there's science to back that up too. It's just shown if you don't know how to read or write, you are able to memorize things better because you don't have that ability to go back and re-upload it basically to your head, so your brain is just better at keeping information in it.
There are lots of mnemonic devices that people around the world use to remember things, right? There's just as a random example, the entire tradition of memorizing the Quran is based on a series of semi-musical processes designed to memorize and retain the Quran exactly as written, right? But the value of having it at hand, right, in your mind, particularly in places where people are less literate, is a real powerful thing for the transmission of that cultural artifact, right? So I think we're all on the same page there. But I'm glad we at least mentioned it early.
Yeah, because it keeps coming up. Now, this one is a particular stickler for me, and we're still in the intro chapter. And this was in the Hunter book, too, and it feels like a try and get out of jail free card for fucking up on occasion. And it's their mature content warning. And I'm going to read this verbatim, because it feels very much like a sorry, not sorry, and it is, for the past few decades, World of Darkness games have addressed the darkness in the real world through horror stories. These games have addressed AIDS, capitalist exploitation, sexual predation, the resurgence of the far-right political extremes, religious fanaticism, state and private surveillance, and many other issues. This entry in the World of Darkness series does not shy away from these themes, and we believe exploration of such subjects is valid in role-playing games as it is in other media. Inclusion of problematic subject in a storytelling game is not the same as glorifying it, and if you take the chance to explore it critically, the results can be the exact opposite. If we are better armed at fighting them. And it just, like, it feels like a very sorry, not sorry, and a self-aggrandizement. It's like, my brother in Christ, you sell like 1% of what Wizards of the Coast does in an already niche hobby.
I think my frustration with this is I feel like it. I'm not. If you listen to Werewolf the podcast, you've heard me say nearly this exact thing, right? And I'm not saying that they took it from me, but I feel like in the context of the rest of this book, this reads real hollow. It is a totally valid truth of World of Darkness games, I feel, but with the rest of it, it's just kind of like a obfuscation of the desire to actually do shitty things and argue for shitty things.
Also, it's not true. They say that they don't shy away from those themes. And in reality, as we read this product, we're more than aware that they do shy away from subjects that they thought were too hard for them to address. In fact, if I recall correctly, when I was trying to write about it in my version, the way Kareem described it to me was that if we addressed these topics now, it would always require sensitive writing in the future, and therefore we shouldn't do it. And so, like, you know, for an example, like all of the themes of indigeneity have been removed from this, except for the fact that if you know about the foundational levels of those themes, you can still see them kind of at the foundation of the game because they're there. They shied away from what it means to be a colonized people by removing those two tribes. They shied away from concepts of feminism by completely rewriting the Black Furies. They shied away from concepts of what it's like to be an immigrant or part of a traveler people by erasing that from the Silent Striders. So in reality, even though they're saying, oh yeah, you know, like these are dark themes and we should look at them, they're actually removing the opportunities that are being presented to talk about some of the most difficult stuff and just throwing in, you know, they reference this last chapter, so I'm going to say and throwing in like, how do we roleplay fascism in our games? And while that is something that we could talk about how to address in games, it just rings so hollow because they've shied away from almost everything but fascism.
Yeah, and because you mentioned removing things from the tribes, I believe the Bonar. Yet I know the Bonars are also can't be people who are not living in a capitalist system. Like that's gone from their tribe, and that was really important for them. The finding the beauty and the chaos and the things that haven't been tied down in urban areas is just removed from that tribe for the sake of going, them not having money is silly.
On top of that, I'm glad you brought up the Bonars, because the other thing that's completely gone now is because the Bonars were represented as almost entirely people who were either connected to or members of the unhoused community. There were also a lot of opportunities in the Bonars to address things like how being unhoused, you're more likely to be unhoused if you're a person of color, particularly Black or Indigenous. You're more likely to be unhoused if you're a disabled person. You're more likely to be unhoused if you're a member of the LGBTQ community. And that's just completely removed. They're now just like scouts.
Yeah, and though it was an imperfect metaphor, and I know that you guys were thinking of removing them from other posts you've done, and I'm happy for you to talk about that, is the Bonars took in a lot of the Krynos-born breed, and that was a huge chunk of their tribe, which brought more, like, I guess, Garu dishonor, and that the other tribes were like, look at them, they can't even keep it in their pants, rather than seeing that those were the people cast off from their own tribes. And I thought that was really powerful with the Bonars.
I think one of the things with the tribes, I feel like we're going to get into this because that's really where this game kind of falls flat. I feel like for all of us, but the presentation of them just it doesn't allow you, as we've already like really reinforced, but I'm going to reinforce it some more. It doesn't allow you to really tackle concepts of sexism or racism, right? It doesn't really let you do that because anybody can be of any tribe, right? There's nothing to stop you from joining any tribe, which makes several of the tribes really make no sense with the way they are written. When we get into talking about the Silverfangs in particular, I just don't see it. I don't understand how any leader figure doesn't just end up with the Silverfangs, right? Wouldn't that be the obvious thing that would happen? There's lots here that I don't get when you really try to like go beyond the glossy cover.
Agreed. So we can keep so I can keep us on track, I guess. I'm just as guilty. We'll go on to chapter 1, A World of Darkness, as it starts to break down. Gaia's dying, come forth the Guru, forever apart, forever feared. Any specific thoughts about this one? I know this is where they start talking about the animistic worldview in this edition compared to other editions. Do you two have thoughts?
A lot of thoughts.
Go.
But the first kind of easy one, I don't have an answer to this. I'm just gonna propose it not just as a question maybe to you two, but to anyone listening. Based off how the apocalypse is described in this chapter, when did it start? I have no idea. Reading through this, I cannot tell what this inciting event was. I can infer. I can make decisions based off of my knowledge of either, real world history or my knowledge of legacy material. But if I'm just reading this book, what is the answer to that question? How long have the Guru been in this state of we are in the apocalypse and things are over? Like, the prophecy's gone. Help me understand, when was it supposed, have they been in it for 500 years? I mean, arguably, I know they're not the original versions of the tribes, but I've often argued that the Ghost Council and the Gale Stalkers have been in the apocalypse for 500 years. But when did it start for the Guru as a whole? I don't understand that in the way it's written.
Yeah, you could argue lots of things, right? You could argue the Industrial Revolution. You could argue when cities started being created. You could argue the last 100 years of but it's hard, right? And it doesn't make sense from a timeline. Where's a timeline?
Sure.
Give me a timeline of things.
Think now, this is going to probably be more charitable than this book deserves. But my thought is just because there's all this book spends more time, I think, than any other werewolf book from Legacy, and I think possibly even V5, in inter-party conflict. Like, there's whole sections about party members coming together, hashing it out, having disagreements, and it being up to the storyteller to rein it back, just so it doesn't bleed into the real world, but that those intergroup conflicts are interesting, which is true. And not having a set apocalyptic event makes sense in the context of your characters could have in-character arguments about that, which that might be more charitable than, like I said, certain things could deserve, because this book also, I think it's in this chapter, I'd have to do some quick reading, but that this chapter basically goes, the worm got stronger because we started polluting the earth, and so that's what made it fall out of balance, because destruction and rot are natural, which, okay, and that's a different take. That one's a matter of taste. That's like, you could argue why it doesn't work for you personally, but for a game, that's a matter of taste. But then I think a page later, it goes, but some werewolves think the Weaver's the real enemy because she trapped the worm. And it's like, there's fuck all talking about that before, and it feels like that was just a copy paste from either a previous edition or what the Hunter team wrote.
Yeah. I think my frustration starts with the reference of the term capitalist within the first like two sentences. And the capitalist era is supposedly the current era of extreme capitalism. Some might hopefully say late stage capitalism that we are in right now. And again, with some of the other language used to describe many concepts within this book, I look at that and go, oh, you're just buzzwording me. You're just buzzwording me with the hope that I read this without any sort of critical eye and accept on the face of it that you are trying to be on the side of those of us who are frustrated with the impending harm, the constant harm that capitalism does to our society. And it's just it's hollow with other things that we will get into.
There is a sub bar that will or sidebar that I expect all three of us to go off on.
I was just going to add that once we get further into some of the other writing in this book and we see some of the apologism written about capitalism, it also rings hollow. But the other thing I wanted to add, it's like it doesn't land in a way that I expect that a setting like this should, like how that should land in this setting, because it's too simple of an explanation. And the truth is that capitalism is part of the problem, but so is like the historic patriarchy. So is the historic insistence on the binary, which comes in through the patriarchy in the way that a lot of humans, but not all humans, which is another thing I'd like to complain about, but a lot of humans throughout history have looked at the planet and the resources of the planet as gifts given to them by God to use as they choose, but there's no call for them to protect those things, because the idea is that it is like the material world is a lesser plane than the spiritual world, and so we don't have to care as much, and we can use as much of those resources as we want, because as long as they're obvious gifts from some divine power. And that, like, attitudes like that are wrapped up in our history and get into our capitalism, but it's not necessarily capitalism itself that comes from. Capitalism is like the end effect of a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, 100% agreed.
Going through there, of course,
we could
Gothic.
Just jump in and we could talk themes, or we could just jump into that sidebar. Like,
all right, yeah, that sounds fine. Right, I do want to bring up that we do get Fomori and Pentex in this, and Pentex, at least in this first chapter, is not all that changed from Legacy. It's a holding group this time, which instead of being a mega corporation, which that fine, I guess. But yeah, they use things that skirt the law. They have your agents of things. Yeah, all right. Let's just go to the sidebar. I think that sidebar is before my sidebar where I get a little pissy. Actually, real quick, going down, yep. I would like to say I did like the inclusion. This is one of the things that was a little more interesting to inject into the setting, was the idea of moon cults, where some guru were just like, no, we're actually children of the moon. I thought that was like a nice little addition in trying to like break up who the guru were.
It makes sense, right, to have little cult groups like that exist in this setting, particularly when you don't have tribes that are kind of that are born werewolves, which was the big like thing originally in Werewolf the Apocalypse, right? That you were a born werewolf, right? But anyway, I could go off on that tangent for years. But not having that means that you don't necessarily have as strong a need for a single religious culture throughout the entire nation. But then they don't give us anything really, except for the Cult of Fenris. And it's like, we'll talk about them, but give me more, please. Give me more about these religious differences if you're going to mention them, because I need something.
We actually hit my chosen sidebar just a hair before our capitalist one, and this one really, really fucking grinds my gears, and it has ground my gears the second I saw it, and I just need to get this out. And for this, we got to do a slight history lesson and go back before Werewolf 5th was even a thing, and they were still under the name White Wolf instead of just Paradox Entertainment pushing their stuff through Renegade Games. And that was when they were New White Wolf. Onyx Path was producing a book called Changing Ways. Then, the lead story developer for New White Wolf, Martin Erickson, a man who considers himself Elric of Melniboné, which the only true thing he has ever said in his fucking life, because he seems to just constantly suck the soul out of everything he loves, or professes to, decided to put a bunch of turf shit into. Just a whole bunch of things about, like, Black Furies killing trans women, and werewolves taking silver knives to their genitals, and shit like that. And it was fucking offensive, and they didn't even tell a lot of the writers. And so I know on Twitter, several writers, like, disowned this book. It comes out. Onyx Path's hand was kind of forced in that if you fail a Kickstarter campaign, you kind of fail. And then they did an apologetics tour for all the Nazi shit in V5. And at the end, Jason Carl is asked, did you put the turf shit in the Changing Ways book? And he said, yes, we're sorry. That was a mistake. We aim to do better. And then they call back to that stupid fucking book by having a sidebar called Changing Ways. So are you actually sorry? Do you understand why people were fucking mad? I know that you don't care about Legacy fans, but is this like a weird and ironically named fucking dog whistle in your werewolf game? Oh, I'm mad.
Yeah, I get it. I was just looking too, because I was trying to decide where is that in the book, and that actually falls a little bit past where we ostensibly are, but really we're just kind of cruising through this book as we think of things, it seems like, which is fun.
Is it? But yeah, let's go to...
Well, that's not till page 47.
I want to add something to your thoughts there, though, since we're talking about it.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the big, not just community response to that was very unhappy, but also the authors who came out and publicly said they're unhappy about it. And then Jason Carl apologized on behalf of the company. So you would hope that when something like that occurs, that the company would be like, okay, we've kind of learned our lesson. We shouldn't do stuff like this. However, I do want to, now it's not as egregious, but it's in the same pattern. I want to point out that by the time we were writing Apocalyptic Record, the Hunters team that I was on writing Werewolf 5th had already been dismissed from the project. However, I had spent so much time while I was on that project trying to educate Kareem, and through Kareem, the rest of the Paradox team, I would assume, on why a lot of the indigenous appropriation in the game needed to be removed. Or at least replace in ways that were respectful. I didn't actually want to remove that much of it. I wanted to replace it in ways that were respectful. And it was a slog. If anyone's read my thing, you can see what that experience is like for me. But overall, what I want to say is, like, we had those discussions. Also, they chose to use my replacement terms and some of my writing in the 5th edition book. So they did learn, even though Kareem fought me on it, they did learn and decide to make those changes on their book with their name and publishing house on it. However, when we were writing Apocalyptic Record, Leith Shields and Matthew Dawkins got the instructions that they were not allowed to change the names of the two peer tribes. I had specifically written in my versions just older brother and younger brother. Again, I choose those names because they're canonic to the text and it's what they call each other. So even though I have some feelings about those names specifically, and they kind of sound like little bit like ooh-woo, like indigenous talk, like this is how Indians talk to each other, kind of dumb names. That said, it's the easiest choice to make because it's what they call each other, so it seems respectful to the text. So I chose to use those names, and Leith was like, no, you have to write the other names. I was like, I won't. You can edit them, but I'm not going to. I don't have a problem if you edit it, post-edit. But that's when I learned that the reason that they were not allowed to change those names, it wasn't even because, like, Leith or Matthew or anything was kind of being dogmatic about the text. It was because Paradox told them they couldn't. Which leads me to ask questions about why they're so insistent on first of all, kind of like accusing the legacy material and the legacy fans. Not that sometimes this isn't unfounded, but accusing those groups of being more bigoted or more hateful or more out of touch. But also, they're the ones who insisted on including the TERF terminology in those titles. They're the ones who, after that education on indigenous appropriation, refused to allow the literally the last book in the line of Werewolf 20th to make those changes. But they made those changes in their book and then claimed credit for them for like doing the right thing. It bothers me.
It should bother you because it undermines and puts it's smoke screen for them, right? So that other people get this blowback that is unjustified. And that is Paradox. Owning the World of Darkness to me is put shields in front of the people they want to put shields in front of and place blame on the feet of people they feel like they can scapegoat easily. And I think, fuck that, right? I think it's complete bullshit and they do it over and over and over again. And I think that's a systemic issue there. I hope at some point they sell the World of Darkness properties because I don't think they are the right stewards of them.
And that dovetails into reeling it slightly back. I skipped that sidebar. My mistake. I thought it was later. So we're going to reel it back. And now we're going to go into the famous sidebar. I can give it a read just so people know. It's called Drawing Distinctions. And it goes, it's important to understand the context of the ongoing environmental apocalypse that defines Werewolf's setting and conflicts. Despite the setting's grand-scale cosmology, humankind is responsible for the choices it makes and for the outsized effects those decisions have upon Gaia, whom they don't perceive as such, and that is in brackets. Companies aren't themselves bad by definition. Companies represent one approach to large-scale cooperation. Even the accumulations of capital aren't inherently bad so long as they are put to positive use. One important differentiation to make is between large-scale efforts and exploitation, jeopardizing the well-being of life from here onward for the sake of personal profit, now constitutes the environmental apocalypse the werewolves see and are facing. It's an emotional issue, but that's why it features front and center for Werewolf. The Garu are creatures of high passion, particularly rage. Theirs is a fight in which they have distinct assets that make poor weapons in the war to reverse the results of exploitation, but they're great assets to have in individual battles to stopping that exploitation. One of the core conflicts of the game is the need to make change, but having to work against one's own nature in trying to best affect that change. And, my God, this is a running theme of this book of appropriating revolutionary language to push a neoliberal worldview. And violence doesn't solve problems. I'm pretty sure there were fucking riots in my home state that we have plaques to because they went up against fucking Pinkertons. Hi, Wizards of the Coast, how you doing?
That's the thing. This really does like to undermine the value of collective action, right? The text consistently finds ways to take pot shots at people who desire to use collective action to make changes, right? And it's subtle if you're not really reading the sentences, knowing how they're intended, right? And I know that sounds a bit like conspiracy theory-esque, but when you read this, right, knowing that Paradox has these particular opinions about things, that people involved in this have these neoliberal worldviews, it's just dripping with disdain and I don't even know what the right word is, like mockery of anyone that is like, well, actually we can change the world if we all get together and do a thing. they clearly tell you that such things are impossible, and you should stop wasting your time and energy trying to fight back against systems of harm.
I am actually like, I know that it's written by mostly Europeans and not Americans, but I'm genuinely shocked that there is not somewhere written in this book, vote blue no matter who to try and win brownie points while being as unrevolutionary as fucking possible.
Yep.
I think it's telling that we have this sidebar that's written essentially in defense of corporations and capitalism. And they describe corporations as being just one approach to large-scale cooperation. But we don't see a lot of other examples of other approaches to large-scale cooperation and other ways that those might be used in the story. And in fact, I would argue that they actually obliterate one and represent it as a failure of large-scale cooperation by starting from the jump saying that the Garou themselves are incapable of working together. They tried this experiment of the Garou Nation and it failed. And that is, the Garou Nation, I would say arguably is collective cooperation. There's some other ways we can look at it about like it's actually a nation, it's a system of heritage, or at least in the old editions, not this one. But largely it is like a lot of different people who are experiencing the same supernatural consequences of their lives. They've been chosen by Gaia to be Garou, and they have different beliefs on how they should defend Gaia, but they've chosen to come together despite having those different beliefs into, you're talking about American politics, but into like a big tent organization and try to deal with those things. And even though there's lots of infighting, they collectively make progress towards the good, or that's the story that they should have had, right? But like instead the book is like, actually this is a bad example, they're bad, they did it wrong, let's just forget that happened, just focus on the town that you're in, or the creek that you're protecting, and like the 3 people at your sept, and that's all you're gonna get, because large scale cooperation only is good if you're a corporation who's spending money on green energy. I don't fucking know.
Yeah.
Green energy, but not Teslas. The book's very explicit about that. Like the only explicit company they call out twice.
Yeah.
It's just trendy. I think that also like the whole like corporations can be good if they're doing the right thing is also missing a lot of really nuanced themes in what it's like to battle these issues. Because speaking of Tesla, or let's just say any kind of electric powered car, let's talk about let's say there's a company that's investing in that, but they're also owning mines to get lithium for batteries on indigenous reservations and sending native people to go in there and get cancer mining it, and then the chemical output from those mines is going to the rivers and tainting them, so that the same nations are drinking that water and getting cancer that way too and dying. And like it's so corporations aren't the solution, and the fact that we had to spend this whole sideboard being like, but what if they are? It's part of the reason, and again, I'm going to go slightly edition warring here, and I apologize, but it's part of the reason why the Glasswalkers were kind of reviled in previous editions by the rest of the nation, is because even though they had a lot of, stepping back, a lot of good ideas, the rest of the nation understood that those good ideas were still harming Gaia in the end.
Yep.
Like I said, it's just taking all this revolutionary language in the rest of the text and then just drops this sidebar, and it's just, what are you doing, man? Don't include it, even if that's how you really feel.
Can I add to my rant? Sorry, I know it was a long rant.
No, please, go ahead.
Also, the third paragraph is so dismissive and intentionally insulting, I think. The third paragraph is like, it's like almost like it's directed to the argument they knew we and other people were going to have against this. And it's like, we know that this is an emotional issue and that maybe it's really hard to understand when you're just like taken over by your anger. But like, you have to understand that your anger is the problem here, not the corporations we're defending. And I'm like, okay.
This book exemplifies, and I can't remember who said the quote, but it's thrown around everywhere. It's that it's easier to envision the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and that would actually be the perfect subtitle for Werewolf the Apocalypse, 5th edition.
James, I think you're right about the emotional thing, right? It is I have said for quite a while now that Rage and Hirano and things like that are not allegories for depression per se. They are not allegories for for anger per se. They're Hirano and things like it. We're going to get into Hirano and Hoglosk, I'm sure, but they are much more appropriate if you look at them from the lens of post-traumatic stress and things like that. And when you do that, I feel like you understand the impact of war and conflict and harm that caused to others, even when you feel like you are doing the right thing. That when you cause harm to other people, that is a moral wound, regardless of if you are right or wrong. They completely fucking missed that point throughout this book. And it's a frustrating point because that just, it rings hollow with the impact of war. It rings hollow with the impact of harm systemically against people and what that does to people. And I really just wish they would have fucking asked people who had some experience with that to write it, because it would have been a lot fucking better if they had. That's my rant for now, I guess.
Fine, you're a Galliard. You're allowed. All right, and then we get our new Karens, which, like, they're more fantastical, like first edition. Once again, that's a matter of taste. I think some of them are fine, just fine. I'll give, like I said, I will try and be as kind as possible when I do see things that are at least interesting in this edition, because there are some interesting ideas that could definitely be mapped to older editions as we kind of go forward. But I think actually one of the more interesting choices, I don't know if it was intentional, but putting just monster hunters or even like H5 hunters of the Second Inquisition as agents of the Weaver was, I think, a good choice and an interesting choice, one that I didn't even, think of. Do you guys have any thoughts on that one? Because they are protecting status quo.
I do actually like the fact that they give the Triad, all three of them, as actual potential enemies, right? The Wild is not presented in this book as a positive in any way at any point. I do appreciate that. And the same with the Weaver, but I feel like there's word count wasted in places that could have expanded on these things slightly more to give you more story hooks. And I often find that the hooks in this are very underdeveloped if they're there at all.
I'm going to go back a little bit to, you mentioned the Karens that comes right before the section we're talking about. My only the thing that stood out to me enough that I wrote it down was, I don't think it's until significantly later in the book, and it's almost an afterthought, it's like one or two sentences, where they talk about the importance of the Karen patron. And the fact that seems to be almost entirely removed is another example of, I think that their approach to what they think a culture defined by animism is really just doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah.
And we'll get to that, especially in the rights section, I think, because there's a right of getting a pack patron that I was like, that is the least interesting way to go about this, but okay. Is there anything else in Chapter 1 that we want to discuss before we finally move on to being a Garu?
I don't think so. Let's hop into Chapter 2.
Let's hop into Chapter 2. All right, so history. The Impergium and the War of Rage are still there, and it's a little more unknown, which I actually think is an okay choice, especially for this edition, given the amount of upfront knowledge and possibly. So when you're presenting a game like this, right, and this is more of a legacy thing, is if you tell someone, the Garu were bad, rightfully so, right, that for genocide, sure, but if you frame it from the werewolves' storytelling and that the werewolves thought they were doing a war against other changes that fell from the worm, that allows the characters to come to the discovery of, oh shit, the nation was bad. And having that in the first few pages of a player's guide, I think kind of removes that, and people have to kind of just pantomime that discovery more so. So keeping it kind of a mystery here, at least, makes a little bit of sense. But I see James has thoughts.
Oh, I want to go along with the flow of us talking about this, because this is the chapter that upsets me the most in the entire book.
Oh, perfect.
And there's lots I could talk about. But one thing I want to point out as we're going through this chapter, because I feel like it's the most obvious to me in this chapter out of It comes up in in the whole book, but in this chapter, the way they write the narration is meant to be disconnected. It's not meant to be from like a specific point of view necessarily. However, I have noticed that I've read this book several times at this point, and every time I read it, it comes more and more to me that I feel like it was almost as if who they believe the cult of Fenris to be and what their belief systems are about who the Guru are is what the narration of this book is. And I do think that that's why so much of the book comes off as super hostile and super negative to who the Guru are. Because there's like the idea behind what the cult of Fenris is almost like this is what the author believes about werewolf society. And so when you read this section, like think about that. Think about like, are you getting a perspective that's like unbiased? Are you getting a perspective that comes maybe from within the Guru Nation? Or does it sound like it's the people who believed all along the Guru Nation were failures, left it, and that they're the ones who are right? And I really think if you look at it that way, not only this, especially this chapter, but the whole book starts to make a lot more sense and how negative it is.
Okay, that's fair. That's actually a really good point. The little side things that where it's like, who says humans are the Weaver's children? They're just part of the greater whole. It's what they do that matters, and it's just like, I get them trying to throw in some ambiguity, but it's once again like everything is supposed to be tied to this spiritual world, and people, regardless of like, you know, nation or anything, are good at organizing things. Like that's required for our survival. And so trying to paint that's that whole point of the Weaver isn't bad, it's the Weaver out of balance that's bad. The worm isn't bad. This version of the worm, I should say, of destruction, entropy, and rot is not necessarily bad, but it's out of balance. And so I just feel those are weird choices.
The next one of those in-text side quotes after the one you mentioned says, "Fuck you, your sins, your guilt, your shame, not mine, but now I have to pay your costs." And I know that I believe that the intent of the authorship here is they're talking about their own ancestors. However, I challenge you to look at this as like a standard response, a standard white fragility response to people who talk about the impact of colonization, which is going to come up in this chapter, and I'm going to yell about it.
Yep. Thank you, James, because I was going to go there if you hadn't, because that is exactly what this is, right? This is written as it screams white fragility. It screams you can't recognize the impact of actions that were taken by people you're directly connected to and benefit from their actions from. But that last bit of it is kind of like, I'm kind of weaseling back down away from that by saying I do sort of recognize that. And it's like, no, you don't, because of everything else there. I want to say here that my biggest frustration with this part of this chapter beyond that is no events are here. There's no events other than the Impergium and the War of Rage, and those are long ago. What the fuck? Why aren't there some things in history that you as a people would go, we did a thing here. There was a great war here. There were some alliance of things here that got destroyed because of X, Y, and Z. Where are the cultural moments within your history? There aren't fucking shit. And if this is supposed to be a cookbook, right, then you've got to give me a fucking thing to make. You can't just give me ingredients and say, make a thing.
So, thinking on James's question of what was the inciting incident to the apocalypse, I would actually think that a Concord and secrecy section might give a really uncomfortable answer to that question, because it would almost say Legacy Red Talons were right, because it goes, thus the Impergium ended and the werewolves began to fade from the collective consciousness of humankind. Soon, rather than warring against humanity, the Garu took to fighting amongst themselves in pursuit of prime hunting grounds and powerful Karens, or even just out of the thirst for destruction as creatures of rage. During these times, the Worm and Weaver became significant threats as cities grew and human greed thrived in relative safety. So that's right after the Impergium, and that would suggest that if it wasn't for the end of the Impergium, the apocalypse wouldn't have come, because humanity would be fighting werewolves with silver, but the werewolves would still be fucking them up. which is unfortunate.
Yeah. I will say also I'm annoyed that the Roanoke colony situation, which is a clear reference to a thing from Legacy, even if it's not. It's clear if you know anything about the Croatoan sign, etc., and the Croatan tribe, middle brother from the Legacy stuff, right? Like, you get that that's an intent there in this section, but they've devolved it to a sept of Garu now and not an entire tribe, and it's like, okay, you've kind of robbed that moment of some sort of like greater storytelling value that could be gleaned from it, but also head nodding towards the Legacy a little bit to go, oh, you could pull in some of that, but it's just a sept that did that now.
It's also such a bad choice for something you still want to bring back from Legacy, because if their true vision of the game going forward is to be culturally and historically agnostic in order to avoid offending people, which I get. I think that's what the reason behind it is, that they say. I don't know for sure, but I think that's why they're doing it.
I believe that's what they said.
Yep.
Then why would you reinvoke something that the Legacy editions got so horrifically racistly wrong the first time? Couching the history of like Croatan and the Roanoke colony, all that kind of stuff, the way they did in Legacy editions was historically inaccurate and based off of racist researchers and historians and what they had to say about it. And so coming back in and being like, let's reinvoke that, and not only let's reinvoke that, but obviously they're reinvoking it at a moment where they're about to tie it into one of the few pages that I can tell that the two indigenous authors that they got in the book after me contributed to the book. Just like, I was like, why would you? I was flabbergasted. I was like, out of all the things you could have tried to connect this to, you connected to something that has a horrifically racist history behind it.
Yep. Let's talk about that sidebar, James. Do you want to dig into that? Because
okay, here we go.
To you, yeah.
Yeah, it's you.
So
This isn't our lane.
Well, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts, but I'll start.
Sure. Yeah.
So, first of all, besides Roanoke, the only other kind of nod to indigenous experience and histories in the surrounding text in this chapter is this small section from the very end of the Concord and Secrecy section. And it says, many wolves also stalked in the shadows of naval explorers and of migrants hoping for a better future across the seas. And any number of Garou watched with dread as colonial efforts came to their shores, fighting back where they could, but usually overwhelmed by the sheer number of human ships. So outside of Roanoke, that is the only nod to any kind of indigenous issue, and also unfortunately couched in terms where it suggests that maybe ships coming with slaves were migrants looking for a better life. I'm sure that was just a mistake of the writing, not intentional though. So this section by the Jennings siblings, and the first thing I want to say is I've said it repeatedly elsewhere. I don't know them personally. I have no ill will towards them. I am more than 100% certain that when they were brought into this project, that Paradox was very hush-hush about my interactions with Korean. There's no way that they told them about this. And part of the reason I believe that to be true is because when they were hired, it was announced, and they were hired originally as consultants, not authors. It was announced, and I directly asked multiple people, including Outstar and Jason Carl, who was it? Because my thought process was like, well, you know, the community of indigenous role-playing game writers isn't very big, and I know a lot of them. I don't know everyone, but I know a lot of them, and there's even a Discord we have together where we talk a lot about projects that are available to us, and if I don't want to do one, I share it with someone else. And so I was like, who is it? Because I want to know, so I can, honestly, the truth is I wanted to be like, hey, warning, there's problems, but they wouldn't tell me. And so by the fact that they wouldn't tell me who it was, I am fairly certain that they also were not told about what happened with me previous to them being pulled in the book. So the first thing I want to point out to in this section is that I agree with everything that's said in that one sidebar. I have no issue with the sidebar. The sidebar itself is an accurate, if short and, you know, missing on some nuances, depiction of these experiences, of what it's like to be an indigenous person. And in particular, since these authors are from, you know, the U.S., this is more of a U.S. and Canadian experience, which they're different, but they're pretty similar compared to being indigenous across the rest of the world. So this is accurate. I'm glad that this got talked about in a single page in the book. At the same time, again, not due to any fault of the authors whatsoever. I'm looking at Kareem at this, to be honest. I mean, maybe it's Justin too, but off of interactions with Kareem, I know it has to do with Kareem. It feels like a sticker that was slapped over the product to be like, hey, you can't criticize the way we're representing indigeneity in this book because this single page exists. However, how does this page actually connect to the text?
Right.
It doesn't. In fact, again, I mentioned that the only things we have are the mentions of the Roanoke colony, and then also they came with the naval explorers, and they also fought against the ships. Nothing in that is talking about what it is like to experience historical trauma. And in fact, the way that werewolves, Garou, are written in this edition is that they have no real powerful connection to their histories. They have no real powerful connection to their ancestors, other than that they think that their ancestors were bad, which is not what it's like to be an indigenous person. You don't look back at your ancestors and be like, well, it's your fault I'm in this situation. That's not the truth, and it's not how indigenous people... I mean, I can't, I am one single native person, and I can't speak for every indigenous person across the world, but I will say out of my community who I've discussed with, my family, my friends, other professionals that I've connected with, because I also work in an indigenous community professionally, I don't think I have ever heard the idea that it is our ancestors who are solely to blame, outside of people who are dealing with severe trauma based off of what they've grown up dealing with. And even then, it's not the common approach, and it's not the healing approach. And when we encounter those people who feel that way, the rest of us are always looking at ways to try and educate and reframe, because it's not our ancestors' fault that bad things happen to us. And so this just doesn't make sense to me. Why is it here? It's like we're comparing this to what the Garou experienced, except the Garou don't even know their history, and the Garou in this edition despise their ancestors. It's just absolutely nonsensical, and it's enraging, honestly, because it's nonsensical. It reads even more, and also because one page in the whole book, it reads even more to me like we made sure that we put this in here because we knew that people were going to criticize how we were dealing with indigeneity in this book. And so that way, when people criticize it, we could be like, actually, we did this really thoughtful approach to it and point to this single page. And if that was the only page, or if the text matched the rest of the text of the book connected to the page, they might have done a good job. But it didn't. And on top of that, let's talk about the other thing that upsets me about this page. Early on when this book was released, it was almost immediate that someone in the community, I don't know who it was, I didn't keep track of this, was like, hey, I just read that page, and I'm uncomfortable with it being there. Like, what, it doesn't, like, I don't understand why it's there. And within seconds, Outstar responded and said, well, that page was written by the Jennings siblings. And so we should celebrate it. However, what's kind of missing from that is, one, I thought Paradox had a policy of not pointing out specific sections of their books being attributed to specific authors. And I thought that they did that to protect them from angry fans coming after them. Like, I thought that, I could be wrong, but I believe I'd heard that before, that was their policy. So if that's their policy, on top of that, like, at the moment someone criticizes Indigenous representation in the book, as thin as it is, because this is almost all we get throughout the rest of the book, that within seconds, their community manager, who, we all understand as someone who is trained and coached on ways to respond to criticisms, has this answer, which is, don't ask us, ask them. And it asks, again, I'm going to get slightly personal here. I'm going to try not to too much in this whole podcast, but it was slightly personal here. It's the same way they responded to people saying, like, hey, the way you treated James Sambrano was kind of racist and fucked up. Do you have anything to say about that? And the response has only ever been, but we hired the Jennings siblings, and so that's all we have to say about it. There was a point when I was working on this book near the end where I realized that Kareem did not actually want to implement any of my visions and ideas that were coming from, one, being an Indigenous person, and two, being educated in Indigenous praxis and being an Indigenous educator. Kareem didn't want any of those ideas. What it felt to me what Kareem wanted was for my name to be on the book, so that when the criticisms of them removing those ideas came up, that my name could be thrown out there. It's like, well, we hired this person, which is exactly what they've done to the Jennings siblings. And I almost wish that I could have. I mean, I probably could have a conversation with them, but I don't want to. I feel uncomfortable about it because I don't know if they want to have that conversation. But I almost wish I could and be like, what was it like working on this? Like, how much were you allowed to do this? Were you aware of what was going on in the previous editions? Because I feel like their whole existence, from Paradox's point of view, is like they exist so that we don't have to answer these questions.
I completely agree with you, James. I think one of the things that I want to add on to in my interpretation of this is like, if this was as intended, I think, by someone involved, was a way of saying, hey, these are the types of traumas the Geru experience, right? And you mentioned this, like, if that was a thing pulled into and written through the text and connected, I actually think that would have been like skin-crawlingly powerful to do that. It really would have done something to understanding the themes of like generational warfare and conflict and genocide and all of these things when you are in conflict with trying to maintain your identity against all of these forces, right? I think that would have been really awesome. And it doesn't. The text doesn't do that at all. And James, you mentioned a thing that I want to touch on as a person who is involved in a religion that does ancestor worship, right? Even if you have ancestors that you disagree with, right? Even if you have ancestors that you think, wow, you did really shitty things, you often have this balance of, without your actions, I would not exist. And how do I balance worshiping the overall actions of my ancestors that have led to me and my ability to have choices in the world, and be critical of those choices as they harmed other people, right? That is an active conversation that I am engaged in on a regular basis within my faith community. Having that as a conversation within this text would have been powerful. It would have been able to be done without necessarily having specific cultural callbacks to specific tribes, but they don't do that, right? They don't give you that linkage, and the lack of those linkages makes, for me, this sidebar stand out, just like James was saying, and say it's just a paper cover for not having the ability to have hard conversations that supposedly these games are asking us to have. This game doesn't fucking ask you to have hard conversations at all.
For me, because this was a blind spot of mine, and your guys' conversation have illuminated that blind spot, at least reading that, because the rest of this book feels so siloed, it did not feel weird for me that it was just there, surrounded by by the text. And I liked it upon initial reading simply because it is one of the few pages that is written in this book that feels like it's at least coming from an earnest place. Like, it is one of the most earnest pieces in this book, which is why I kind of liked it. But I agree now that I've heard kind of both sides from you guys on this cast and off this cast about its placement that kind of detracts from that, which is a shame because, like I said, it is earnest, and it's only a handful of places where it felt like someone actually put real heart and soul into whatever they were writing.
I think that's so fair, and it supports kind of where I'm coming from too. And what I had to say was, the authors of this page did a great job. They did. It's only one page, unfortunately, and like if you get into the academia behind this, you know, people write 60-page essays about this. You write whole books about this. But like outside of that, they did a great job. It's just that whoever, you know, we say whoever, but Kareem's vision of the entire book, or Justin's vision of the entire book, or the two of them, it's just completely disconnected. It doesn't reflect what the rest of the book is communicating. I also want to just point out one thing. I know, again, if people have read my stuff, about my experience in this, they already know about it, but I do want to point out the other thing that I love about this one page and how it's written is that this is the only time in the entire book where the authors/editors seem to remember that when you are talking about indigenous people, you must capitalize indigenous, because indigenous people throughout the rest of the book is always not capitalized, which is dismissive. Anyway, that's it.
Yep. I have a lore bit that I want to add on to this that
Sure.
I find frustrating. The character in question, who is supposedly has written this sidebar, is a Silverfang. And while, of course, we have to recognize in this edition that all the tribes have no connections to any specific places within the world, that feels like whitewashing. I'm sorry. That feels like, this historically tribe that epitomized like white supremacy and the ruling classes around the world. That's the tribe we're going to assign to this character. And I'm like, that reeks of not a good choice to me.
I think that is largely to do. I would assume that it was the authors of this page that chose the tribe. I don't know, but that's my assumption. And I would assume that that comes from the fact that if my perspective is accurate, that they aren't familiar with legacy material. Instead, they're seeing that the Silver Fangs are representing leadership, and so they're potentially choosing this tribe because they want someone who's maybe in tribal leadership to be talking about this. I know that they are themselves involved with some tribal leadership, and so that might be where that's coming from. However, I still think your point's valid. And it also comes up at the very beginning of this chapter. I'm scrolling back a little bit. Every chapter gets a little quote under the title. This chapter's Being Guru. The quote under the title of this chapter, in which we discuss what it's like to be a colonized people on this page, is "Conquered, we conquer." Which, again, tone deaf as fuck when you include this real world experience in the book. Because the suggestion from the beginning is like, we may have been conquered, but we are also conquerors. And conqueror is not something I think is appropriate to apply to indigenous praxis. And it's unfortunate that it appears that way.
Agreed.
100% agreed.
So then we get into Auspice and Tribe, and I think I'm okay with kind of fast tracking through this one because they go into more detail later. But if you guys have particular thoughts of the tribes written in this section, I'd be happy to hear it. And this is where we see our moon cults, where it's created the tension in the Garu. And like I said, that is one of the new ideas that I actually really liked. That's a good idea, and if I ever run a legacy game in the future, again, I might even include moon cults and like cross-tribal camps of that, because it's an interesting idea, and it creates a new kind of tension that isn't just worm bad.
I like them. I think it's a good idea to have those. I said that before. I really do. I think moon cults is a cool concept. Give me more, please. Like, give me more to dig into. I do want to say about auspices, though, and we'll talk about this more probably, is they do nothing in this game mechanically. There's no point in having auspices. Why do they exist? That is my biggest frustration with them.
Yeah, they just give you access to gifts, Josh. You got to get the right race class combo.
I had the same response too, because the more I thought about it and the way this game was written, I was like, why is anyone any auspice but a rune in this game?
Right.
It's like they wrote it only thinking of a rune. I do have one small thing I want to point out in this section on the tribes that I don't know if it comes up later or not, that I thought was ridiculous. If you go down to the section with the wayward tribes, which includes the back spiral dancers, the cult defenders, and the stargazers, I want to look at the stargazers section. Stargazers saw the fracture of the Garu nation before it happened, and left it to seek other ways to thwart the looming apocalypse. That kind of fits vaguely in with Legacy Revised Era material, okay? Then it says, their patron spirit was once the ever-changing chimera. But who can say if that's still true? They could. They're represented in the allies and antagonists sections as usually allies who are there to help out. That, you don't necessarily, maybe you don't like their approach to dealing with Gaia's death, but they're your friends for the most part. Can literally no single Garu just be like, hey, who's your patron spirit?
I
think literally no single Erge be like, let me look at the spirit behind this person. Like, it's just bad writing. I
actually think it's bad for other reasons, because I think it is explicitly called out in the allies antagonist section of going, they parted ways with Chimera, it seems, and it seems like both parties were cool with it.
But then who is their patron?
Yeah, it's still,
the question is still like, who can say if that's true? Like, ask them.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's fair.
Use your Theurge powers.
Look, James, there's just too much rage, capital R rage, to talk to people you mildly disagree with. The Garu are a stand-in for those pesky liberals, after all. Jesus Christ.
You mean not liberals, but like those angry blue-haired leftists.
Yeah, the leftists, yeah. Well, they don't know the difference. Come on, you're giving them way too much credit.
My apologies, you're completely correct.
Here's one thing I thought was an interesting choice, considering some other statements they made. That's right here in this section. Is they reference Mari Cabra. They reference her. They reference Albrecht later. There's a few things that I think are other probably references to canon characters. I find that fascinating, considering they wanted to expunge all of the legacy material. Why do this then?
For those legacy fans who have asked the question, if Albrecht and Mari Cabra are being referenced, what happened to our friend Evan? I encourage you, once it comes out, to look at my reference to Evan in Icons of Rage for 20th edition. I hope you enjoy it.
I like that tease.
That's all I like that tease too. The playfulness in James's voice has me intrigued.
I need to talk about this. I'm just going to start talking about it. So, Geru no longer are born into a tribe, right? They are no longer born werewolves, right? They just randomly werewolves occur out of humanity and wolves, right?
Well, maybe because there's the part where it's like there's definitely Garu in family lines, so like they didn't even do that correctly.
Yeah. But then they do this thing, right, where they talk about family of choice. Family of choice is a concept, right, that is not new, but the way it's being talked about is a very relevant thing today, particularly in queer communities, right, where we are saying, hey, we can choose to have families of choice, right? We can separate ourselves from harmful family members, and we can create families of people who love and revere and protect us, right? I love that as a thing in the world. I also, as a scholar of identity creation and reinforcement and things like this, don't see anything here that tells me how these groups actually create, reinforce, and further tribal identity through time outside of a connection to a patron spirit, which has been suggested to me is a totally valid way for that to be pushed forward, a tribal identity to be really connected to the patron spirit. But then please give me something that tells me how to do that, how these groups do that. I know this is my thing, right? But I'm like, I'm here. Other people who know about these things are here. We would have loved to have been able to talk about these things in a tiny sidebar or like 500 words in a way that'd be like, these are things that people do to procreate their identities through groups, right? This is, if you're wanting to make it an analogy to queer groups, how they keep queer identities going and connections to queer history going, these are ways that people do that. These are ways that these different groups do that. Different subcultures within the subculture, right? I just want some head nod to understanding that is a process that actually requires action, and it's just not here.
So this came to my mind while you were talking. Is this book almost treats like community, like a fandom.
Yes.
It's the surface level love of one thing, and there's infighting and subgroups of subgroups, but there isn't any actual community. It's like you've got people shipping Gorgon to being girl boss white feminism, and then you have them shipping Gorgon as ultimate social justice warrior.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
I think that this book and the way that they're approaching family has a lot of problems. And I know that the thinking behind it was that they wanted to separate the idea from breeding, which was really heavily implied in the legacy material, which, was, I think, arguably one of the worst depictions of like just gross attitudes from Guru society. That said, I do think it misses the point that like a lot of those gross attitudes were written in there, but it wasn't the sole description of what mattered about that. And I also, as much as I support the idea of found family being an important thing, especially as you mentioned in the LGBTQ society, like I really think different versions of this deserved to be highlighted. I really think we should have talked about what it means to, grow up in families of marginalized communities, because part of the reason that exists for that's a big deal for LGBTQ people is because you have a lot of homophobia within your family. And that requires you to go seeking out people that don't have that homophobia that you can connect with as if they are your family. But then there's other issues, such as, let's just throw it out here, racism. So if you grow up Native, if you grow up Black, you often cling to your family and your close community of maybe more distant relatives, but like I'm talking like cousins, second cousins, because you know that they understand your experience being marginalized by society at large. And I really feel it really missed a lot of opportunity by not just being willing to highlight that both things were true. I think that there were absolutely ways to write about what it means to be guru in a community of not all wolf changing shifters, but people who were connected to you, but just humans who understood you. Maybe like humans who shared things with you that meant that they weren't affected by the delirium. For you to explore what it meant to be that without emphasizing the breeding, and it unfortunately the choice just means that we miss a lot of really awesome storytelling opportunities surrounding what it means to be family of these particular types of supernatural beings.
Wholeheartedly agree.
100% agree. Yep.
So going through, I guess, wolf life, that was a weird one, which is like sometimes they want to just be regular wolves, but they can't, and it's just like, or regular people and they can't. It's like, okay, there's nothing really that stops them. Like, the only thing that stops them from doing it, because the curse is fucking gone, which it has to be if there's no kinfolk, is the fact that the game says, punish your players for trying to hack the rage system by changing between forms to make sure they lose rage. It's literally the only reason why they couldn't. I mean, what is to stop a character from doing regular Garu shit, getting to 0 rage, doing regular Garu shit, and then going, sweet, no rage, I'm out, never gonna howl at the moon, you can't make me, and leave.
Yeah, there's nothing stopping that. There's nothing stopping a person or a wolf from being like, you know what? I love being a wolf. Fuck that werewolf shit. Nothing. I kind of like that, but not in a game way. Like, that's I can't tell a story there.
I see you took the reluctant Garu nature.
Yeah. Within the context of this particular established setting, it makes sense to me that there'd probably be a lot of both human-born and wolf-born chosen guru who'd be like, you know what? Not worth it. And just choose to fuck off. Because there's no real Garu, like, I'm going to say Garu Nation, but it's not like the big political entity I'm talking about so much as the cultural ties, the connections that teach you why what you're doing is important. Like, so many of them have forgotten their history, all that kind of stuff. It would make sense to me that people would be like, wow, this kind of life fucking blows. Never mind. And then that's it.
Yeah. It would be an interesting thing to say, there's shit tons of werewolves. They just don't want to be involved in any werewolf shit because it's terrible. That could be interesting, right? That could be an interesting plot line. The text doesn't give us that. James's good ideas give us that.
I mean, that might have shown up in a different version of this game that we'll never see. Who knows?
Who knows?
Speaking of stuff that would have shown up in a different version of this game, though, let me just briefly jump back to the sidebar before that, discussing the Stolen Moons. I'm not going to go too deep into this, except to say that this is a direct example of writing that I did. Stolen Moons was done by me and was used in this book without me being credited. So that's all I want to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Call that shit out for real, because the more people hear about it and the more examples of it, like, the more undeniable it is, because you also have some receipts. And they have shown 0.
Yeah, I've got lots. Well, they're not going to. They're just not going to respond.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And honestly, they're not going to because it's not... It's. Let's talk about American politics again. Sorry for the podcast listeners that aren't in the U.S., but they're not going to for the exact same reason that Donald Trump is not going to show up to the GOP debates. All those guys that are vying for the GOP nomination that aren't Trump don't have a chance to get it from him. They're not going to get it, and he knows that. And he knows there's literally the only... him responding to them and sitting on a stage with them and looking like that there's equal interchange will only weaken his position. And that's them. They're a huge fucking company with a huge fan base that is pretty loyal from what I've seen. And I'm like one author, and I'm not like a Justin who has like this massive catalog going back decades. I've written on a dozen books. I'm one of the main people behind Essence 20. I guess is the biggest claim I could make, but that's a new thing. It doesn't have to them. I'm nobody. And so it's much easier for them to just never address it and never speak of it again. They have their loyal fan base who will go out around the internet saying how I'm like a clout chasing bigot or whatever their thing is they're going to say about me, and that's good enough for them. They don't have to address it, and also they can't because I have the receipts and they don't.
Yeah. Well,
Yep.
I'm glad that a racist such as yourself would jump on a podcast with two white guys.
You know I hate all white people. Like that has been a truth about me from the beginning. All the writing that I contribute to any World of Darkness games has literally just been me trying to reinforce the younger brother theme of hate all white men, because I think that that's the only way to define what it is to be an indigenous person.
Glad you could come on my...
Someone's gonna quote me on that and just like not mention any of the
right.
Yeah.
Out of context.
It is super out of context. In fact, they gotta find me first. It's only 300 subscribers on YouTube.
Well, we'll see
platform.
about boosting this in places, you know.
Yeah, well, sure. So moving on, Garu culture is just the litany.
It is just the litany.
It's just the litany.
Here's the thing, though. There's a litany here, and then this is a really interesting thing that I don't think they do it here, but they call it out later. They have the codes and creeds of honor, wisdom, and glory, which are forgotten by 99% of people when they're running Werewolf. My friend Dove is super into them and always likes to remind people about them. I find it fascinating that they kept them, because it just doesn't seem like it's in tune with their other editorial choices that they made. But this litany is given without any real context, really. Like, it's a tiny bit of obvious context, and then that's the end of it. And that's fine, but I just think it's boring.
Yeah. And then we talk about our pack structures, of course, and the pack structures are okay, I guess. Like, some of them are clearly references to other media, which old White Wolf did, so I can't be too upset by that. But, James, do you have something? Sorry, I thought I heard someone come off mute. I was looking at my book.
Oh, no, I actually didn't come off mute, but since you called me out anyway, I find that the pack structure is, like, okay, but kind of not interesting and also not the best at reinforcing the theme. But one thing I wanted to bring up was I felt, and this is a little bit personal, but I'll keep the personal out of it because I did write something about this, but I really did feel it was a huge missed opportunity for the game developers here to write pack types the same way they did the coterie types in V5, because those were actually pretty interesting. Now, you wouldn't want them to be the exact copy because some of those would not make sense for Werewolf. But you could have done like really cool pack structures and given them like special bonuses based off who they were as a pack. You could have tied that into the pack patron, which, you know, we haven't gotten there yet, but I have some issues with how patrons got written in this too. Mm-hmm. But ultimately it was just like, you know, there's nothing, I'm not like looking at this as like this is a horribly written section, but I am looking at it like it was a huge missed opportunity, especially with all the other ways in the book they tried to make this look like Vampire 5th. In ways that didn't reinforce the theme, but here was a way they could have used it in a way that absolutely reinforced the theme, and they just completely skipped the chance.
I agree with you on that, actually. I was thinking about that, but for some reason my brain was doing, well, that's in the system section, so of course that's where it can come up. But that makes no fucking sense at all when I say it out loud. But yeah, I agree with that, and I thought that would have been that's such a great way of doing it, because you're right. The coterie section in V5 is one of the better parts of it, and just missed opportunities.
Absolutely. You want me to like betray the whole I only exist because I want to ruin Paradox reputation I have?
Oh yeah.
I will compliment Vampire 5th to hell and back for that system, because one of the things that never in Legacy editions that maybe I shouldn't say never, but often didn't work well, was because you write vampires as being so like backbiting and trying to, you know, stab each other to like get a little bit more notice and status, that you would often have that happen within your coteries to the point where sometimes they would fall apart. But by writing those coteries and giving like your coterie like a definition of who they are as a people, as a group that is kind of like maybe not formally but informally like oath to each other's, you know, protection and furtherance of status, it really enhanced the feel of that game. It really gave a strong sense to who the coterie was that no other edition of Vampire did. And I thought that was a great thing, and I was looking forward to it showing up in this, and it would have showed up in a different version. Anyway, sorry.
I just want I want to move from the pack thing, right, and move to seps. Seps are I don't know if I don't have a problem with seps as written here. I just don't, because they're still the same thing. They are the groups of Geru that collect around a cairn and protect the cairn. Cairns are kind of devalued from what they used to be, and they talk about moots and they talk about these things, but I don't quite feel like we get enough of a sense of this is. There could have been some mechanical things here, right? There could have been a cairn building system here where you can design your own cairn that creates mechanical elements, right? And
well, I think that's later in the book, though, isn't it? Like the cairn building.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I have only read this once fully.
Yeah,
so
there's a cairn building one, I think, right after Advantages. So this is all informational, but I want to get to one thing I thought about real quick, and then I'll let James speak, is that their seps are now several packs of werewolves working together, but they add no superstructure for the cohesion like they did in previous editions. So seps just feel like they're not really all that connected. It's like you're with your coworkers, and maybe the Karen patron is the boss, which would play into all the neoliberal themes of this edition.
If you even have a Karen patron, because as I mentioned, it only gets mentioned like in a side sentence, like once way later in the book. On top of that, a couple of like just I don't know if it's editing direction or something, but later on in the book, they do reference a Sep's Master of the Howl. Like they talk about dealing with the Master of the Howl of a Sep they're visiting or something.
Yep.
And I'm like, but what is that? And again, that's just like, someone was writing the old edition. This one decided we don't need to have set positions anymore. That got forgotten and missed. Like either, I'm not saying like one way is better than the other, but I'm saying either you describe what those positions are and include the Master of the Howl sidebar, or you don't and like watch your editing and don't reference Legacy that way. And then the other issue, speaking of you mentioned rights, they're really like so seps are described in here. It could be one pack, right? But it's like 1 to 3, like they don't get very big.
Yeah.
But the problem is if you do any sept rights, if you do rights that aren't just with your pack, the likelihood of you all flipping out and killing each other goes up, and it pretty much destroys role playing opportunities for connecting with the other packs that you're sept, or making a more cohesive sept culture or connection. Because you're like, wow, I got to stay away from these guys because if I spend too much time with them, we're all gonna like just flip out and rage at everything.
Which emphasizes the theme of a sept. It basically says there's no point in having seps, there's no point in working together. Again, undermining the whole ability of communal action for a thing by saying, oh yeah, well, you're just going to get so mad you kill each other, because clearly that's what happens when people get together in groups larger than 6 people
that aren't a corporation.
Exactly.
Guru corporations can be good, because Guru accruement of capital is a really good way to spend. I don't have a funny end to this. Just maybe if you're rich enough, you can buy off your Howglosk and Rage.
Ooh, yeah.
Let's add that as a house rule in our version of this. The more resources you have, you can just spend money to buy off Howglosk and Rage.
I thought it was just going to be a supplement that they're going to charge $59.99 for in a couple of years.
Maybe. Yeah.
That seems underpriced.
So that's a good segue into Hirano and Howglosk.
Yeah.
I really have lots of thoughts here, so I'm going to dominate this for a minute. Hirano and Howglosk are a meter, right, from one to the other, and you start in the center when a character creation. I don't have a problem with that mechanically. I think that's somewhat interesting. This idea of like depression and extreme rage is on its surface was one of the things when it was teased earlier that I was like, oh, I'm kind of interested in that, right? That seems like a good way of sort of trying to explain what happens with some military and other groups, other people that paramilitary, I'll just use that nicer word, military and paramilitary people, right, who are often fighting those two like is my conflict and my actions within this conflict completely useless, versus I'm so far into this that I'm just not really thinking about my actions and their repercussions and just doing what I'm told. I think that's interesting. Here's the fucking problem. Hirano as depression doesn't work. I said that before. And they really, really, really overemphasize that it is depression. And I don't, if you're going to tie it to a real mental health thing related to war, that's not the right one. If you ask me, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I play one on TV, I guess. I feel like it's not accurate to what they're trying to go for, though I do at least respect the intent there. Here's the fucking problem, though. Hoglosk is just making fascism a mental health problem. Everything that is written about what Hoglosk is just an excuse for saying, oh, people who are fascists and people who are like hyper critical of other people and want to genocide them, that's just mental illness, which is bullshit. It's bullshit that it's written this way. It's bullshit that fascism is a meter versus depression. Like, what exactly do you think that is telling people? I don't know how other to read this than that. And maybe someone will come along and go, Josh, you're being an asshole. But the way Hoglosk is written here is fucking insulting on multiple fucking levels. And with everything else, it's just like, holy fucking shit. You want to apologize for fucking fascists all over the fucking place, don't you?
And in this chapter, it's worse. I think in the character creation section, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, in that they are written a little better, in that now it's Hirano is not quite depression, but hopelessness. Mm-hmm. And Hogloss is fanaticism, which do correspond, I think. But this leads into another thematic weirdness, is a couple things, actually. The first one being, if you hang out with your touchstones, you can move one Hogloss to Hirano or vice versa. They do not disappear, which seems real weird when it's like, are you feeling too fanatical? Spend some time with your loved one and get sad. Or feeling too sad? Spend some time with a loved one and become a fanatic. That's a real weird message, and I think it's unintentional, to be fair, in the game, but it's real weird. It's a real weird thing. And my other issue is that you get Hogloss for violating a Chronicle tenant, which, okay, I like, to some degree, I think that's an okay mechanic to go off of. Since that's how humanity is set up in Vampire, that's how it's kind of set up in Hunter, but not as well. So I kind of get that. But one of their example ones is a Chronicle tenant never show mercy. So if you show mercy, you risk getting closer to Hogloss, which is insane.
Right.
Don't put that in your example.
Yeah, it's nonsensical. I have another criticism of using the Chronicle tenants as like violating the Chronicle tenants, supporting how you gain Hogloss. And obviously Hogloss is meant to be a punishment for behaviors you don't want the players, not the players, but the player characters to be engaging in. But the issue I have is that often Chronicle tenants, the way we're describing them, they're used to set up what the theme of the game is, which means they're ways of talking about what kinds of stories the players want to tell and are excited to tell. That also sometimes means, when you said the Chronicle tenants, that it's about what kind of stories they don't want to tell, what kind of themes they don't want to explore. And so I feel like that creating a mechanical system, even though it's punishing, I still think creating a mechanical system around violating what people in the beginning said that they were wanting to do creates a lot of potential for harmful situations. And I think that setting it based off the Chronicle tenants was a bad choice.
That makes sense. I think it's the same kind of thing someone talked about on the old White Wolf forums, who was a developer for Exalted Second. The idea was to tie, the perfect defenses to virtues, and the conviction one was, if you ever went against your motivation, you would lose the ability to. And the idea is that it's like what am I looking for? A dramatic moment, right? you're doing something and you violate your convictions, and because of that you've been weakened, and that's very dramatic, but in practice they didn't think it far enough out because no one's gonna do that. And I think for the Chronicle tenants, it's what James said, like ideally that's kind of a cool concept. You have these ideas and then you've gone beyond them, you've broken them for Gaia, for that fanaticism, but because that could violate someone's lines in what they want out of a game like this, it creates an issue.
Yeah, so like I might propose in my game that one of the Chronicle tenets I'd like to include is always protect innocence. And that can be like a cool theme about like this is what our pack's about, this is what we do. But it also means that not necessarily every time, but I might have proposed it because I'm also like, you know what, I really don't want to roleplay the idea of us hurting children. That's just not something I'm into. But unfortunately, what that means is it kind of invites a scenario where someone else in it who maybe doesn't have that feeling was like, well, my character's gonna kill this child because a bane infested it, and then you're like, and now I'm gonna gain Howls and everything, and then we're gonna roleplay that out. But then meanwhile, I'm sitting there being like, wow, I really did not want to roleplay this, and this kind of sucks.
Yeah.
In the board game world, that's called a feel bad mechanic, right? That makes everyone kind of go, oh, that feels bad. I don't want to do that. I don't want to ever have that happen. And in board games, you try to avoid feel bad mechanics because it keeps people from playing your game. I'm emphasizing here because it does the same thing here, right? It's going to make people not want to play this game if they have one of those situations. And ultimately, isn't that the opposite of what we want from a role-playing game book, right? We should want people to keep coming back and playing your game.
What you just said broadly is such a theme of this book, too. It's like there's so many feel-bad mechanics in this, and there's so much feel-bad theme, even, where it's like, why am I playing this? It just doesn't feel good. I mean, you know, I'm sure plenty of people will get something out of this, and that matters. And I want to honor the fact that you can make beautiful stories out of bad systems. Like we all three of us here have certainly had experience doing that. Yep. Honestly, including Legacy Edition. Like I've talked about rewriting the peer tribes, the brothers tribes, to be less offensive and have a much better experience out of them. But like at the same time, it doesn't mean we shouldn't stop and like sit down and be critical of the fact that they've written in so many ways to have a bad experience.
Right.
No, it's important to be critical of media you enjoy just as much as media you don't enjoy. And
I think the other thing there too is, right, like, what was I going to say? With feel bad stuff there, right? Like if you're rebooting it, get rid of the feel bad stuff, right? You are not tied to the legacy feel bad. Just get rid of it. And there's this interesting choice they make throughout this where they don't go far enough, right? They kept the Fianna term, right up until people were like, you know, that's a word, right? That has meaning, right? Because I know, James, you said some things about this, like they didn't even think about any of that unless someone was already telling them, hey, these are real words with real meanings that have impacts on people. And they either should have gone all of that way and made a whole new game, or they should have, I don't know, done this better. That's the only thing I can think of. But it's just, they try to play in the middle and it sucks.
It does. And I've made the joke with you before, Josh, that it took a whole ass internet hate campaign to convince Paradox that the Irish were actually people.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's something I have talked about elsewhere a lot, but I do kind of want to just go over it again since we're here and maybe people listening haven't read the things I've written elsewhere. And ultimately, there's kind of like a couple different issues going on with the Fianna problem. And one of them, and for those listening, if you've only read this book, the Fianna are now the Heart Wardens. So the issue is that when they brought this book to Hunters Entertainment, the team that I was part of, the idea that it would be completely culturally agnostic was not actually the case. It definitely had a removal of some cultural ideas, and it wanted to lessen some. But a really good example I can give of this is that while Kareem gave me a lot of pushback about writing Younger Brother / Winter's Teeth / Galestalkers as being indigenous at all, I was also given support for making Older Brother / the Ghost Council still connected to their indigenous roots. And in fact, I don't show as much about what I wrote about them because I'm not talking about the better experiences I had, but Kareem liked that version. I got compliments on that version. So it wasn't the case that it was completely culturally agnostic, but it was the case that the cultures they wanted to lessen or remove were things like indigeneity from younger brother, which didn't make sense to me that was the one that I had to get removed from, because out of the two, that's the one that's way more connected to it. It was feminism from the Black Furies. It was any kind of traveling culture from the Silent Striders. But it wasn't removing fascism and Nazism from the Get of Fenris, which is the extreme example, but it also wasn't removing pretty much any of the other more European-focused cultural tribes, and that included the Fianna, which is why no one really batted an eye for a long time about keeping the Fianna essentially with the same name. And honestly, I don't know about how the writing was when they took it in-house, but I assume it probably kept it a little bit with the Irish origins, at least, because in our version, they had no problem with that. Fianna are a really good example of, in Legacy, are an extremely worldwide tribe now, but they just have those origins. But the whole Fianna is just a word thing, literally is an artifact of the fact that they had someone on their previous team who did all this work for them, again, uncredited, to work on all of these non-European cultural things, particularly indigenous cultural things. And they used all that work because they're like, oh yeah, this is a good idea, we'll use it, we'll eat it up. But then, like, they didn't really have anyone bothering with the European stuff because they figured it was fine. And that's also comes all the way back to my argument that trying to make real world settings culturally agnostic is literally impossible. Because if it's a real world setting, when you quote unquote cleanse it of culture, what you're really just doing is making a vacuum that is filled in with a culture of white supremacy. And I know that that's a triggery word for a lot of people who are defensive about whiteness, but I do not mean white people when I say white supremacy. I specifically mean the culture that many of our global nations sit in, which is the idea that whiteness makes you a better breed of person. And I will point out, when we get to the tribes, I'll point out a section, I want to say it's in the Glasswalker section, where it's really obvious to me that they just failed to erase cultural connection because they just accidentally inserted white culture that people outside that culture couldn't even understand unless they were in it. So we'll get to that, and I'll point that out. But that's my big rant.
Oh no, and I agree, and I said this elsewhere as well. But no, I don't expect people to follow me on my many discords. Is that this is a white supremacist thing, and it's not a paradox problem exclusively. It's that it is the view that European cultures are default when they're not. European cultures, like German culture, is not white culture. German culture is German culture, and trying to homogenize all of European cultures is white supremacy. It's the reason why white tries to be a culture in America rather than a class, which it is, because America had the ability to actually cut those cultural ties even from its European immigrants, and intentionally so that you could have a homogenized, quote-unquote, white culture, not an Irish culture or a German culture or a British culture even. And that's the problem. And that's like I said, that's not just exclusively a paradox problem, but it is one.
The other thing, too, and we've kind of hinted at this, is they don't actually do it. They don't actually remove the cultural elements from several of these tribes. The Black Furies have several references to Greek cultural things, including in their gifts, including in their patron, including in other bits and pieces here and there. Clearly, the cultural elements were not pulled from them. The Heart Wardens,
literally, the very name of their tribe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I want to add that in there.
You're right. The Heart Wardens, the former Fianna, literally have several gifts that are the exact same names from Legacy Editions and reference Irish cultural artifacts. Right? The idea that this was a full attempt to remove culture from these tribes is frankly insulting if you have any knowledge of the legacy or any knowledge of where some of these cultural things come from. If they had given, say, I'm just going to pick a random one, the Gale Stalkers, a Irish myth connection to a gift, I'd be like, or at least you're trying to do a thing, but it's just not there. I don't know.
They even messed it up with because I would say like most of the cultural artifacts we still see are connected to different European cultures. But they even messed up in the case of the Ghost Council, because when I wrote them, I was like, let's change the previous name of Uktena, because it's appropriative, to River Serpent, because that can represent a lot of different, indigenous and even you just marginalized groups' idea of what that spirit is supposed to be. But when they went and did it, they made it Horned Serpent. And Horned Serpent is still drawn from a specific native belief, and so it's like they still fucked it up.
Over and over again. Like if you're reading this again with a slightly critical eye, you can just find instances of this over and over and over again. We're already talking about the tribes, Keegan, so let's just fucking get into the chapter and talk about tribes, right?
Yeah, let's skip auspices. They fucking do.
Yeah, right. Auspices mean nothing, basically, in this
No. Can I say one thing about auspices?
Sure.
Because I feel like the auspices section is really important to understanding the work that went into this book. Because I think that nothing epitomizes the gorgeous setting that we've been given and the vast lore we have to draw from to build stories in this book more than the final sentence in the Arun auspice, which is "fuck you, worm." Just brilliant writing. I know that I can build so much theme and setting out of that, and I'm so glad that that sentence appears in the game. Fuck you, worm.
Yes. The other thing that's great about this is the clear Dave Bautista art for the Arun. I'm just saying.
Yeah,
it is Dave Bautista, and somehow this stolen, and it's also Dave Bautista as his character from Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
You can even see some of like the tattoo markings in it still.
Yeah.
And the best thing is, I don't even think this is the most ridiculously obviously offensive stolen art in it, because we haven't gotten to the Silver Fang section yet, which is, in my opinion, the absolute best stolen art in the game.
They did change that though in one version of the I don't think the physical versions, but I think the PDFs. There's a version of that art that's changed.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Can we talk about it when we get there, and you can tell me about it?
Oh, sure.
'Cause I didn't know that.
So I'm gonna say one thing good about the tribes, in that I kind of jive with the idea of the favor and the ban for each tribe. Like, I think that was a good idea, and I actually like it for several of them. There's a couple I certainly tweak. The only other thing I will say is, I get that every tribe has its own renown, but why didn't you do... And I get why the auspices don't now, because when you look at the gifts, the auspices have at least one gift for each renown, but making it favor renown so that you could get very interesting and fate. So, like, let's say a Fianna Arun is going to just be glory all the way down, but then like a Ghost Council Thurge might be wisdom out the wazoo, though it's honor that draws spirits for reasons I'm not entirely sure. But combos like that, and that's gone. It's, why would you not put all your starting renown, all 3 points, into your tribe? Like, that makes very little sense to me. But with that, we now hit the Black Furies, a tribe who is now switched to the Social Justice tribe, and it is explicitly called out that they're bad at it.
I think that's all I have to say about them. I don't hate the Black Furies as written here, except that it's clearly derisive to social justice movements and people involved in social justice throughout this 2-page spread, and that's pretty impressive.
The last 2 paragraphs say that, or have that, like, the most explicitly in their initial write-up before the Patron Spirit, because it says, it's a role that requires vigilance and self-criticism. All too easily, empathy can turn into pity, and pity into disdain, and the Black Furies who long ago took on noble causes can find themselves worn down by the constant needs of those who have been marginalized. At the same time, righteousness can turn into hatred, and the Black Furies may have enemies for the sake of having enemies, even where none truly exist. A perilous risk when mixed with Garu politics and Karen meetings. At their most extreme, Black Furies can even become accelerationists, consumed by infinite campaigns of bloody vengeance. Why wait for the crypto farm to waste a small nation's GDP in energy costs when you can wreck the mining operations before a bunch of tech bro chodes can buy new Teslas? Fuck Tesla anyway, since most of their power from green electric cars come from fossil fuels, and fuck you for doubting. And it's just like, this is nitpicky, but that's not what an accelerationist is. Google,
it's that
motherfucker.
nitpicky. I don't think it's that nitpicky. I think that is actually a really important thing to bring up because not only in the Black Fairies chapter, but the Black Fairies chapter is a really good example of twice. It's not even just the accelerationist one; it's also the social Darwinist comment. But they invoke philosophies without understanding what they are, and in fact, in this case, they're representing it as almost the opposite of what accelerationism is.
Yeah, I think that's the takeaway here, right? Is there, as Keegan said at the top, right? They're appropriating revolutionary language. I like that phrasing. They're appropriating revolutionary language and misusing it intentionally. I think it's intentional. I don't think people don't understand what accelerationism means or social Darwinism means. I think someone intentionally was like, I want people to misunderstand what these words mean. Maybe that makes me a fucking conspiracy theorist, but I just think Kareem's a fucking white supremacist and he likes to misuse these words. I could be wrong. I willingly accept that. Please don't sue me.
Technically, I think if you just say, in my opinion, of course, here.
Of course, you're right. In my opinion.
Can I just add to what you're joking about here? Because I do think it matters. It's really hard to say what the motivations of that individual are because we don't know him other than like our interactions with him. We don't know what he's thinking. However, whether or not the case is that it's intentional or that he's acting as a member of that culture without realizing he's furthering the problematic aspects of it, it doesn't really matter in the long run because like tearing him apart, like it's obvious that I don't like him, but like it doesn't matter to the broader problem of the fact that people like him exist within like the upper echelons of this entire industry, not even to mention other creative industries, and they're the guiding voices behind it, and it's why shit like this pops up. It doesn't matter to me, at least, this is in my opinion too, whether or not he is intentionally furthering those ideas or he is doing it because that's the part of the culture that he is part of and benefits from and isn't able to see outside of it. The end result is the same thing in that the ideas of white supremacy get furthered in these products.
I agree with that. I also want to just segue into saying we see the first musician archetype, right? And it gets repeated. I think you see it 4 or 5 times in the tribes, right? And James, you were talking about this earlier, right? Like musician clearly is important. They get that music and song and story are a thing that would exist in the Garo Nation, but without really actually understanding why.
My camera's not on, so I mean, obviously the listeners can't hear, but you two can't see me. When you brought this up, I like smiled so big because I wanted to talk about this. Because not only that is true, and you're going to see repeated throughout here, there's almost always an archetype that's a musician. There's a lot of them. My favorite one being the SoundCloud rapper. Yes. But when we were writing our archetypes examples, one of the lists you can see an example where I shared my Ghost Council write-up. It came up, and this is a fair criticism in a way, but it came up that a lot of us, when thinking about Galliards, wrote some variety of historian. And Kareem was like, why are they all historians? This doesn't make any sense. They shouldn't all be historians. Like, you have to make them differentiate. They've got to be different. They can't all be historians. And I'm like, that's interesting because the final product is, well, they're all musicians.
Wow. Sorry, that makes my head hurt.
Yeah, like, hey, here's a good point. Let's keep going. Like, what a weird way of, like, horseshoe theory in editing.
Yeah, who knows?
But... So
I have nothing else to say about the Black Furies other than they removed the entire heart and good and bad heart of the tribe, right? The fact that the tribe was second wave feminism and had a real like strong turfy sort of like attitude was a very interesting one to actually like have to decide if I'm making a character that is a Black Fury, how do I balance that, right?
Yeah, and I definitely made it so that was the bad camp, like how every camp has their antagonist one. It's the J.K. Rowling camp of, the Black Furies.
Even though this is a little bit more of like, we're discussing legacy and not the 5th edition book here. Mm-hmm. I do think that it's important to point out when we're talking about the Black Furies that a lot of the turf stuff was written in one of the tribe books primarily written by Seder Bricado, and I love Seder. I'm not talking shit about Seder, but I one thing that I do think other fans of Seder and also critics have noticed is that sometimes when he writes about villainous groups, that it's harder to differentiate whether or not the intent is for that to be like what everyone should be, the line everyone should be following, or whether they're villains. And like that criticism came up a lot in a more recent 20th edition Mage book, the Book of the Fallen. And so I just want to point out that my understanding of who that person is as a person and what his political beliefs are is that the turfiness that is in the Legacy edition of the Tribe was absolutely intended to be villainous, whether or not it got interpreted that way.
I agree with you that they were designed to be like, oh, we don't. I feel like so much of the original Werewolf the Apocalypse was, don't be like this, right? These are what the shitbags in the tribes, leadership and otherwise, believe, and you should be as a pack pushing against all of that rather like harmful element of culture, which was an opportunity, right? There's an opportunity to write that in a way that you're like, oh yeah, we are pushing a bit against these things like fascism within the nation's structure. I think that is a legitimate thing to do, and this book pretends to do that and just doesn't actually present it in a way that makes sense for how you would push back against that if it was a thing that is infesting your culture.
It's a very European view of culture almost, or white even, in that it's that old culture bad, new culture good, not there are things in my culture that do great good for me and the people I love, but there are things that are absolutely hurt others who I care or don't care about directly, but should be remedied. And that's a level of nuance that should have been there, and it's just not in this edition. And to their credit, it does seem like at least a lot of my interactions with online fans, several people didn't grasp that either.
Oh, lots. Yeah, it's a problem with the writing, and one of the reasons why when I talk about Werewolf and especially Werewolf 5th, I'm always saying, hey, I'm not edition warring here, is because I have lots of criticisms of Legacy. Legacy's got some awful shit in it, and Legacy also has a lot of, and I don't think it's the majority, though I do think they're loud, fans who cling to the villainous elements in the game and are like, no, that's what I want to be playing. That's who I want to represent because I believe this in real life. And those people are problems. I just don't think it's the majority. And I also think we do have to criticize it. And there was a lot of opportunities that were more than just all werewolves are bad that we could have used to criticize it in this book.
Yep.
Yes.
Just to say, anyone who's listened to Werewolf the podcast knows that I am critical of the legacy of Werewolf the Apocalypse. Just listen to Ways of the Wolf. Just listen to several different episodes where I'm like, this is a problem. This is why this is a problem. But James and team were writing a book that addressed those problems in a way that was healthy, that was better, that was getting us to a place where we could reflect on the legacy and go, that those were problems and those have been adjusted so that we have opportunities for hope and growth and positive reaction to negative things in our society, not a book that kind of wallows in them and says, oh, you're just not going to be successful anyway. Boo-hoo.
It's doomerism, the book, yeah.
Yep.
So,
Bonars.
Bonars, yeah, Bonars. I like I said, earlier in the episode, I don't like their removal from the disenfranchised or trying to find the wild in the Weaver aspects, and they're just scouts, and they're just really uninteresting to me.
It does, though, like there are bits and pieces here, right, where they reference them being part of countercultures and disadvantaged segments of society, but it doesn't quite give you like the reason for that or a way that feels like for it to really doesn't have the essence, right?
The closest it gets to it giving you a reason is, I want to say it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 paragraphs in, and it says it's a classic chicken and egg story. Were the Bonars always at the bottom, so they adapted to the tricks and trades at the bottom, or were they so good at skullduggery and dirt finding that they were pushed out of polite society by colluding pipe smokers and rhyme-saying furhead nobles? I'm not going to read the whole paragraph, but that's the closest they get. And unfortunately, not only does it do the Werewolf 5th edition thing of being like, who knows? It also really, it's like it's so passive in the importance of that theme. Really early in the podcast, Keegan talked about the Bonar's original concept being tied up in a lot of anti-capitalism, and I would stretch it further to say that it is like how the ways in which the marginalized parts of communities survive at the bottom, because you have to learn how to do that, because you don't get anything when you're at the bottom. You have to learn how to move through it, and that's just completely missing. And I think the reason it's missing, like when you look at the verbs that they were using to describe all the tribes, which appear in the beginning of all these sections, the Bonars got infiltrate, pilfer, witness, and surmise, and none of those have anything to do with that concept, so it just didn't really appear here.
Yeah. Also, like, they made a big hubbub about those verbs, but they're essentially meaningless in this book. Like, they were doing the verbs. The verbs are the important thing. We couldn't include the Fenrir as a good tribes because we didn't have the verbs. No verbs. Out of verbs. Sorry. Do you want pronouns? We got no verbs.
I have to take a moment to point out that the statement that we didn't include the Fenrir because we couldn't get good verbs is actually a lie.
Yeah, it's a straight up lie.
Yeah, this is a straight up lie. Like, everyone knew it was a straight up lie, too. Like, if we're being honest.
But there's enough people that like, listen to the party line and are like, oh, yeah, well, and they repeat it. And it's like, don't new speak for them, right? You don't need to do that. It is okay to be like, no, that's a lie. And just don't defend it. That said, one of the second person from the left in the art is clearly a character from Letterkenny, which I have just started watching, and I'm just amused. I'm amused by that. I keep finding other people I know from.
Should we keep stopping to point out all of the like ripped off characters? In this
we will get off this call in 3 hours from now.
They're all stolen. Yeah. All right. Wow. Children of Gaia. Do we want to talk about the Children of Gaia?
Sure. The Children of Gaia got dumbed down because... So, this was in the subtext, I feel, in Legacy. And I understand edition wars and all that, but the subtext was they're white liberals. They're white liberals, and they think that if we just, like, we're all one race, all our problems would go away. And anyone who listens to the episodes of the podcast know I play that to the hilt. I do it imperfectly at times. Sorry, I'm making shit up on the fly, and I'm an imperfect person, but that is how I play them. They are a tribe that thinks, well, if everyone just saw past tribe, saw past race, and then just were colorblind and patron blind, we could save Gaia. But they also were like pretty okay diplomats, and people also thought they were kind of toothless in a way that made them interesting. And these guys are just like a himbo tribe, in my opinion. Like they're Bane, where Unicorn is forthright and deception and despises dishonesty. If the child of Gaia must lie or misdirect or hide truth specifically for personal gain, they may recover only a single willpower. So it's just like, that's a nightmare for me as a storyteller, because someone's going to do something for personal gain, and then they're going to try and like lawyer their way to go, no, it was for the cause, because don't you remember blah, 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 blah.
I mean, that does sound like the group of people that you're saying they're based on, so that makes sense.
I didn't want to make it a meta thing.
So that's fair. I'm gonna call back to Legacy just to say this, though. Like, you're right. That was how the tribe was written a lot, except then they were also explicitly tied to Middle Eastern diasporas, specifically, even though they don't explicitly say so. It's very heavily sort of like hinted that they probably have a lot of Jewish members in the tribe.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think they do say that explicitly in a few places. I know they explicitly say they also have other monotheistic cultures that come from that part of the world in the tribe, and it's one of the only tribes that accepts that because it's so alien to what Guru society believes as a whole.
Okay, yeah. I wasn't... it's been a while.
So that, to me, like, for me, like, I always play the Children of Gaia as significantly having a portion of Jewish werewolf. So I think my frustration with that, like, thing, that, like, history of them is, like, it doesn't... It's problematic in so many different ways. But, like, it just... now has nothing, right? I look at this and go, I'm going to specifically just say 5th edition here. Like, I've got none of that interesting stuff here with the Children of Gaia. I don't know how to play one of these. And they were one of my favorite tribes. So I don't know. I don't know what to do with them.
I have a criticism of them that's not really based off the old edition, with the exception that the change was made because of the old edition. But they were essentially rewritten. This version of them does not bear very much similarity to Legacy Children of Gaia. It has a little, but it's very, very different. And I would say out of all the tribes we looked at so far, we haven't got to Galestalkers yet, but of all the tribes we looked at so far, it's the most different. Unfortunately, the way they wrote them makes them sound like they're doing a lot of the same stuff in the Garu Nation as the Ghost Council is. Like they're looking after secrets and mysteries in the Umbra, and they've made them into a much more spiritually focused tribe, umbrally focused tribe than they ever were in previous editions. And so again, I'm not making the comparison so much as saying, unfortunately, because they wanted to rewrite them, they kind of failed to give them a good niche, which I think is also what you're experiencing, Josh, because you're like, I don't know how to play this tribe because they don't really have a niche anymore.
Right. And they could have had the niche, which they sort of had in previous editions, of they were trying to intentionally create linkages between the tribes, right? To build a Geru nation. They don't have that because now they're doing a lot more Umbral stuff, right? They talk about these connections of people in their favor, but also talking about how spirits interrelate as well. And I'm like, if they had just leaned on the people and Geru, I would have been all in for it. I would have been like, yeah, cool. I can play the Child of Gaia that is going intentionally and going, hey, folks, we have a common enemy. Let's put our shit aside and work towards a common goal. But yeah, I agree with you, James, otherwise, that they're not distinct enough.
All right, next Galestalkers. Any thoughts?
I also am a fan of the Hunters in Darkness in Werewolf the Forsaken.
Nice.
That's almost all I have to say about them, except for the fact that this is another example of them failing to completely cut out their references to Legacy. Because why does Northwind, who is not the previous cannibal patron, have a cannibalism-based ban? It's just, I don't know, it's just uninteresting and poorly done. That's all I have to say.
All right. Ghost Council, where we're 4 for 4 with with stolen art.
Oh god, yeah. Every single one of these pictures was found. Actually, this is, I think, the only tribe where every single picture was hunted down and found.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, James, you put up your write-up
God.
for the better version.
I mean, people can have their opinions. I mostly don't have any major issues with this, except for if they were gonna use my work and not credit me, I wish they would have at least properly talked about what Ghost Council meant as a name, because they are not the ghosts. and they are a tribe that's about communing with spirits of all kinds, which includes ancestor spirits and the spirits of the dead, and that is why they are the Ghost Council. And so it just bugs me. Like, they were like, we'll steal some of your work, but then also kind of just fuck it up. I've already posted the comparison and people can make their own decisions, but I do think that whoever wrote the patron spirit took what I wrote and then just modified it slightly, because you can see like sentences where like the same two words are used in the sentence, and it's like a similar concept. It's unfortunate that they chose to say horned serpent instead of river serpent, because once again, we're failing to remove cultural references. And I don't know. I also like High Lung, so it's cool that Maria Franz is a member of the Ghost Council because I love her.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of her being here too. Otherwise, the archetypes for the Ghost Council are really boring. Right? A shepherd is interesting in vague ways, but really, how is that going to work in the story? Right? Contemplative, cool. How are they going to actually be involved in the story? Right? Witch, all right, cool. Yeah, you can be a witch and be involved in the werewolf scene. I got that. Saboteur, you could probably do that. But I don't know. Like, these are just the dullest fucking archetypes I can imagine.
All right, Glasswalkers got removed before the final version came out, but with the most infamous stolen art that kicked off everything initially.
I was wondering if it was intentional or just kind of accidental, if the replacement head on the art, because that's like mostly that and the tattoos are all that got replaced, is that from a picture of B. Dave Walters?
That's what I keep thinking too, James. Right? Like it really looks like him.
It looks a lot. It's like this facial hair is different, but just like the face itself looks very similar to B. Dave. And so I was just wondering, who knows? But it's interesting.
Now I remember you said that there's something in here that you wanted to talk about, James. I believe where it was removing culture.
Oh, yeah. It's maybe you two might know what I'm talking about and be able to point out where it is. But it's like a sentence where it's talking about them going down to the bar or something, but they use a very specifically, I want to say, British way to describe doing that. Maybe it is. Okay. Maybe it is not in the Glasswalkers section. I'm trying to remember where I saw it. I thought it was in the Glasswalkers section.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any pub references or anything like that.
I don't think they call it a pub. It's some weird phrase that, like, when I read it, I was like, "What the fuck does this even mean?" I had to look it up.
Wardens.
Want to just move past it?
Oh, yeah. We can keep.
Oh, maybe it was in Heart Wardens. Actually, maybe it was in Heart Wardens.
I think it might be. Yeah.
I think we should just say something about the Glasswalkers. Like the Glasswalkers in general haven't been changed that much, but are pretty boring without anything to really like counterbalance them. Right?
I think part of what makes them boring is that this version of Glasswalkers used to exist in a version of Werewolf in which it was unusual for everything to be really focused on humanity and being human-centric. And so they kind of were an exception to the rest of the Guru tribes. Unfortunately, because this version has shifted so much away from what it's like to be a wolf, you know, for better or worse, completely remove what it's like to be Krynos-born or Wolf-born. It's so human-focused that the human-focused tribe just feels like, well, okay, I guess. The version I wrote, just really quickly, the version I wrote had them reacting to the Gaia dying and the impossible situation they were in by turning into cultists who were supporting the spirit of the machine, which is a Celestine. Yep. And we're trying to like do things like create new technologies or spiritually awaken older technologies because they thought that the more that they empowered the machine, that the machine could potentially replace Gaia and be something that they could use to survive on. Now they can't break things.
Yep. Breaking Bad. Our Liberator is a great fucking name for a concept.
Yeah.
I just Tattoo Artist is the other one. It's like, okay, weird. Yep. All right, Heart Wardens.
So this is the bit, James, I think that you're referencing before, like, or even a hidden bit of green space in the CBD in New Orleans. Maybe is that a thing that? Because I don't know what the CBD.
That's not it. But I do think that might be a fair, like, we can't totally remove the sentence I'm thinking. I'm just going to talk about it. If it's not here, maybe a listener will be able to pick out where it was. But there's a sentence somewhere within this book that references the pack of Guru going down to the bar. However, it's not said that way. I can't recall how it's said. It's said in a very specific British euphemism that if you aren't from that part of the world, you don't know what it means. And the only reason I want to point it out is because it's just an example of how when you try really hard to remove culture or be culturally agnostic, what you're going to do is just fill it in with the dominant culture.
I actually kind of like their favor and ban, but I gotta say, under the concepts, digital Karen strategist sounds more like a Glasswalker like archetype than a Heart Warden.
Yeah, I agree. It's unfortunate that they didn't want to represent Glasswalkers as being more technologically forward. Like the art that's part of the stolen art is a tattoo artist, and honestly, you could have flipped tattoo artist and the digital Karen strategist, because a lot of the culture that the Heart Wardens are coming from is artistic in its sources, and they're still kind of represented at least a little bit in that way about their devotion to they talk about celebrations in history and like ways that they revel, but this is still definitely a more artistic tribe than the Glasswalkers are, and so those could have just easily been flipped.
Yeah.
This is where we have our SoundCloud rapper too.
Oh, right? Yes,
the MC.
The MC, yes.
You're right. What's interesting here is like most of the archetypes are like non-location specific, but this one is like hyper location specific, right?
Yeah.
Like they're in Queensbridge in New York, right? Like, why did they have to be so specific for this archetype?
I understand the reason. I don't agree with it. Well, let me say, I would have agreed with it in a different version of Werewolf.
Yeah.
But the reason they're specifically highlighting Queensbridge is because of its association with a lot of black music revivalist history. And so they're trying to, I think what they're trying to do is be like, look, you can be a black member of the Fianna, which let's recall that up until the last minute, this tribe was still called the Fianna. So I don't imagine the tribe name changed the text at all, other than swapping out Heartwarden for Fianna. So I think they were just trying really hard to be like, oh, I know they're called Fianna. I know it's an Irish word, but let's make sure we're saying that other cultures can be involved. So let's invoke this powerful, black movement to represent that. I think that's where it's coming from. I will add on to that, though. I also think it's a little slightly insulting that they made this character a SoundCloud rapper while referencing that, because SoundCloud's fine, but it's not like, it doesn't have a reputation of being like where all the greatest artists are coming from. This is all I'm going to say.
Right.
Also, I feel it's a little insulting. It's like, do you not think that there are any black Irish people?
Right. Oh, yeah, no, that's definitely a part of the problem. Absolutely.
that one. Yep. But, all right. Moving on, I guess. Red Talons. They're basically just as genocidal, but now also people, so they don't have, like, the hurt of their... like that we're going extinct hurt, but also they're like the only tribe that goes, maybe the Weaver's bad.
My thing with the Red Talons is like you took the thing from them, right? Mm-hmm. But you still left the thing in there enough that Legacy fans are just going to say, oh yeah, they're all wolves. But everybody else is going to look at this and go, oh, I could be a human and be a Red Talon, but I don't know why you would want to. I don't understand. I don't know. For me, this is like, just there would have been nothing wrong with saying they are an only wolf tribe, right? That actually does not hurt the idea of removing human cultures from it. I think that would have been fine. I also would have changed their patron from Griffin, because I've never understood Griffin. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I never have felt that way, but it's here. So that's my thoughts on the Red Talons.
I'm going to add on to what you're saying by saying I think this is another example of, by rewriting this in a way to be quote unquote more inclusive, you've actually kind of accidentally created a human philosophy in this. When they were wolves, it was really easy to tie their belief system to a combination of how wolves have suffered at the hands of humanity and what rage does to you. But now that you have a lot of human inclusion, the way that this reads to me is that this is a tribe of nihilistic atheists who essentially are like, all of humanity is bad. Everyone should die. That's the only way that things are going to be good. And
actual accelerationists.
Yeah, the actual accelerationists. Yes. And if you didn't just make this decision to make them so human, but keep this old philosophy, I don't think it would have landed that way. But because they are, it's like the worst parts of society are represented in this tribe. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, they are the actual eco-fascist tribe that's still playable.
That's what I was going to say. I'm not the first person to notice that a lot of the fan community have pointed out, like, the way that the Cult of Fenris is written, it would make way more sense for this to have been the tribe that fell. I still think it would have been questionable writing if that choice was made, but I do agree that with the way they're written, they're almost worse than other than the Nazism that snuck into the Cult of Fenris, they're almost worse than them.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed.
Yep. I think they're even worse, and they're, in my opinion, worse morally than the previous edition's Red Talons, and that's quite a feat.
They've chosen not to discuss very much, and I feel like what the legacy version of Red Talons was always redeeming was that when you got, like, they had this knowledge that was based around what it was like to be an animal and what it was like to live in nature and in the wild untouched. They were the most wild tribe. They understood the wild the best, and that was a really powerful redeeming quality of playing this tribe that otherwise was pretty genocidal. And that's just not here.
Yep. Other interesting thing that you have that from legacy stuff you could have pulled into this tribe was their connection to prophecy. And that's a line of story that kind of comes and goes for the tribe, but like that could have been interesting for them here, right? That they are more tied to prophecy than other tribes for some reason or another. But of course, you don't have any prophecy in this game at all. So why would you do that?
Josh, how could you possibly make a tribe focus around prophecy in a game that has no lore?
Yeah, exactly.
Shadow Lords. They're, for the most part, unchanged.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
the same tribe. I have no comment. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Yep. I have one comment. There's a clearly culture with the boyar archetype.
Oh yeah.
Otherwise, they're the exact same tribe. They're still my shadow lords. So I'm happy about that at least.
Silent Striders.
Why are they cursed?
Yep. I thought the same thing.
What does that mean? How do they feel about it? How does it impact being a Silent Strider when you play one? Once again, Werewolf 5th edition, who knows?
Because there's no lore, there's nothing to connect you to anything. Why? And this, if they really want to make this a world of darkness, this is a clear, let's use some connection to the ministry still, and just slip a reference here so we can go, okay, there's something related to this group of vampires. Fine. But you don't have to define it, you just give it as a hook, and it can exist there. We don't have anything.
You could even rewrite it to be only werewolf. You could be like, maybe Owl is mad at something they did in the past. Like, I don't even care what the reason is. Just like, unfortunately, when you're playing this tribe, part of your major theme is this curse that you have no knowledge of. You have no understanding of. It should impact anyone playing this tribe, but you don't know how to do that.
Yep. For being as uncaring of Legacy fans, this edition, like you both have referenced, seems to really like rest on you knowing at least some Legacy lore, despite it also having in big bold letters at the front, this is a reboot / reimagining. And
again, I'll just say my belief on this, my perspective on this is because it was not originally. It was not a reboot originally, and when they switched to that, they didn't switch a lot of the thought behind building it. So
yeah, which tracks. It's no longer on YouTube, but there was an intro video with the whole Hunters team, and it was very obvious that it was going to be a continuation of the previous edition, just like how Vampire was explicitly stated as a continuation, and now they've just tried to like tricky dick sneaky say, no, it's always been a soft reboot. I'm not fucking stupid, man.
It's not true.
No, yeah. And some of us were literally in the room when Martin Erickson and Donna A said, this is a continuation of the game. Like, you can't gaslight me out of being in that fucking room and hearing those exact words and hearing about the love for the legacy, for all the problems there, but all the love of the legacy, right? And the desire to create an integrated world of darkness into the future. You're not going to convince me that didn't happen. Sorry.
There's that, and then you can move one step in the history of the development of this book beyond that to the Hunters Entertainment YouTube video that was released with the author interviews, where we all talked about not only what we loved about, again, legacy editions, and also like the things we were excited to address that we were going to potentially change in this edition to make it even better.
Silverfangs.
Silverfangs with Al, good old Al.
Best art in the game, Al Bundy. No ma'am. Aw, Peg, leader of the Silverfangs, puts his hand down his pants but doesn't want to fuck his wife, Al Bundy. I could not think of a better face of the Silverfangs than college injury football star shoe salesman Al Bundy. I'm so glad he's here, and I anticipate playing in any Werewolf 5th Edition game I get invited to. I will just play Silverfang Al Bundy because he is my hero.
Here's the funny thing, though, is they actually changed the art. So the head is now no longer clearly Al Bundy. The rest of the pose is still Al Bundy doing the whole
body.
shitty football thing. Oh, yeah, kept the body. But
it's funny because that's also the most obvious part, because it's the same jacket with the letter change from P to T, and the shirt has no changes.
It's a straight ripoff.
And then so just like we were talking about the Silent Striders, why are they the nobility? How? Because quite frankly, I think the Silverfangs are a worse statement in this edition than previous, because in previous it was like resting on the laurels of their ancestors' achievements, which, you know, makes them kind of shitty. In this one, they're the aristocrats and the leaders because of divine right, literal divine right, because they follow Falcon.
Right. But it doesn't make any sort of sense. Like, why is Falcon in particular, other than falconry being a thing that rich people did back in the day, like, why is that the patron spirit here? Why do they say this bullshit? Garrus society is inherently tribal, okay, and where tribes exist, leaders emerge. Well, no shit. No shit. That's what humans do. Whenever humans get together in groups of 4 or more people, someone's usually in charge. Sorry. I don't understand why the Silverfangs fucking exist. How can they exist as the tribe of leaders? You'd have leaders in all the goddamn tribes.
Especially when there's no nation.
Right.
Well, okay, speaking of that, and again, I don't want to do this too much, but one of the proposals that I made really early on that got shot down when we were working on it was I was like, hey, you know, the stuff you're saying about using the Get Offenders to fall, or actually the Sword of Heimdall, doesn't canonically make sense because that group doesn't exist anymore. And again, this edition was not a reboot. It was still connected to the old lore. And I said, what if it was the Silverfangs? And what if them basically, like, they're, instead of being, I know they really wanted Howgloss as the example, but I was like, thematically, they could have fallen as a tribe to Hirano and been like, we're not fighting anymore, we're done, none of you will listen to us, we have only failed for the last several centuries, the Gaia's dead, we've failed, we're going to sit down and die. And you remove them as the playable faction. And then what you have is the fall of the Garo Nation makes sense because they're the ones holding it together. So you can have that storyline with lore that like why would the Fenrir leaving make the nation fall? It doesn't make any sense. And then on top of that, you could have all the other tribes kind of like trying to fill in that gap, which would be excellent storytelling fodder. But, you know, again, we're mostly reviewing this book that did come out, not the one that didn't come out, so I don't want to spend too much time complaining about that.
Sure. But yeah, like I said, they're leaders for divine right reasons, essentially. In just how they're written, I think.
Yeah, I just think it's stupid, right? It doesn't make any sense. There's no reason. So that just makes me mad. And I don't need tons of reason. I just need a reason. And the reason you're giving me isn't even a reason.
Yep. All right. Character creation, we can skip over most of this, though I do want to point out, I'm just going to talk about this briefly, and you guys can jump in for anything. Karen being an advantage is weird. 5 being an awakened Karen is like, huh. But the other one is having a day job. Day job makes no sense as a merit, I think, because isn't that just face? Like, if you're gonna have one or the other, don't have both. They're not interesting. And this is a greater complaint I have with fifth edition. Substance abuse is not an interesting flaw. Stop including it in your fucking books. No one uses substance abuse. It's not a good flaw. Like, it was only kind of interesting in Vampire because your prey had to have that substance, like, in their system, which creates at least interesting story opportunities occasionally. But here it adds fuck all. It adds fuck all in Hunter. It adds fuck all in Werewolf. And the problem I have with 5th edition is, and I just house rule it away, is you're required to have 2 dots and flaws, which on its own isn't a bad thing, but it is a bad thing when you have a ton of merits that are kind of interesting and backgrounds that are interesting, and all of the flaws are uninteresting. They just add nothing to the game or your character in most cases.
I have a ton to say about this section, except that I want to point out that I do think it was, like several other sections in this, when we get into the rules section of the book, I feel like it was kind of facelifted from V5, especially with the fact that fame shows up as a merit here, whereas in Legacy editions, I think only that showed up in 20th. Normally, werewolves did not have access to that. And again, that's kind of edition comparison, but also, like, what benefit does that have in when you're a guru? It actually is kind of a flaw. And then I do want to point out that one of the most iconic werewolf as fuck cool roleplay backgrounds didn't show up in this. And no, I'm not talking about Pure Breed. I'm glad that's gone. I'm talking about Ancestors.
Yep.
It's just gone. It's just gone. Also, if Ancestors existed, the Silent Strider curse would make more sense. It was like one way of explaining the problem.
I also don't quite understand. So, like, the mentor one, because it says, like, they've got Renown 1, Renown 2. It might be in a different section. I'm just misremembering, but I don't think there is any kind of inherent rank in this one. It's the total number of renowns. So if there's supposed to be a Renown 5 Garu, that's actually a very inexperienced Garu, unless it's ranked at a specific...
I will say it is saying in their most acknowledged category, and I do think it's poor writing. I do think it's poor writing. But what that means is if you have Mentor 3, let's just say your wisdom is 3, but it doesn't mean your other ones are 0. So you could still have more renown than that. I just think it's not well written.
Well, yeah, but also it makes no sense because then that means their top renown is 1 at 1 dot, which is going to be lower than what most players are going to have.
No, I agree. Like, Mentor 1 doesn't make any sense.
Here's my issues with this section. Looks is dumb. Why? Why do we need that? Right? We don't need to get into beauty standards shit in games anymore, people. We can get away from that, right? That's not actually a thing we need to work into our roleplay. And I kind of get it in Vampire. It kind of fits in Vampire. It doesn't fit here, if you ask me. That's just my opinion on it. And the lore sheets, when you get to the lore sheets fucking suck. There's basically none. There's like 3.
Oh, man.
Why?
There's 5.
Oh, okay.
2 of them are like kind of nonsensical. It's like, why would you ever take this? And then also the lore sheets are a point of contention because it's one of the sections in the book that implies that while Black Spiral dancers are redeemable, the Cult of Fenris is not. So you can save like the corrupted by the worm, we're only here to destroy and hurt everything. You can potentially bring them back from the brink and show them the true way. But when it comes to the fascists, nope, they are who they are, and that's it. That's the end of the story.
Yep.
Ooh.
Yep.
I feel like that touches on the whole issue I have with Hogloss to begin with. Like, and saying that is like, while I agree that there are lots of fascists out there that are gone from probably being, saved, you can actually do interventions with people, right? It is possible to do interventions with people that can get them like to think about it and change their mind, right? There have been some really big cases where that has successfully happened. I'm not saying it's going to happen for everybody. I'm not saying it should happen for everybody, but like saying it can happen for the Black Spiral dancers and not for the Cult of Fenris are stupid.
Yeah, and because Hogloss is written in 2 different ways, it's even worse if you take the other interpretation of Hogloss not being a fall into fascism, but a fall into blind fanaticism for your cause, because it means that you're too fanatic for a cause, even if that cause is climate justice, that you are irredeemable.
Yeah.
Like, even if we take the most what am I looking for? The most charitable interpretation of what Hogloss is supposed to mean, that actually makes the implications worse.
Yep.
Renowns. Any thoughts real quick on renowns?
As I mentioned before, they had the codes and creeds that made me and Dove happy.
As Kareem would often say on our edition of the book when he didn't like something we wrote being too attached to old editions, I'll quote him and just say this seems cut and paste from previous editions.
I actually think it might be word for word from Werewolf's 20th Anniversary Edition.
Oh, fantastic. Lovely. More plagiarism. All right, touchstones. So I'm going to go into touchstones quick. We've talked about this earlier. Touchstones allow you to shift, regain willpower, I believe, and they also let you shift Hogloss or Hirano, which is just gamifies the touchstones. When, like in Vampire, they're very grounding. In V5, touchstones are one of my favorite mechanics. They're very grounded. They're very interesting. And I also think that they're very limiting in Werewolf specifically. I've talked in other places, and I'm told, I'm not on there, that in the official Discord, someone asked if a spirit could be a touchstone, and they said yes, but that's not in the book, so we can't. Is that touchstones should have been people, wolves, spirits, and locations, because if you make it a specific location that's close to your character, that once again grounds it in the ecological themes, that makes it so that it's very interesting to actually like harm it. And I think
it also sorry, I just want to add one more thing to that because you're right, but I want to add something.
Sure.
It also grounds it in a lot of the animistic philosophy at the core of Werewolf, in which you're exemplifying your connection not to just people and things, but also to the places that matter to you, and those connections matter to you.
Yeah, the anthropocentrism of Werewolf 5th really works against it. And the other thing is that if you run this game, it is my recommendation that you work in a system of somehow the scenes with touchstones can also remove a point of Hogloss or Hirano, not shift it. Because that makes more sense. It makes your connections make more sense. and it adds a deepness of connection that is sadly lacking from this edition, in my opinion.
I was just going to add one more thing. If you're talking about house ruling the touchstones rules to make it fit the theme that even this game itself, the 5th edition version of this game, is trying to support, I would say every storyteller who runs this should say that every single player in their game has a touchstone with their Cairn spirit, because what touchstones do for you in this game is absolutely something with communing with your Cairn patron should do for you.
Here's the other thing that I'm going to lean into. Animism, one of the things about animism, from my understanding, is it's about relationships. It's emphasizing relationships. Touchstones as a mechanic is emphasizing relationships. You should be able to have relationships with other beings that are not human or are not wolves that make sense. You guys have already said that, but I really want to emphasize, you're actually talking about animism in a way that is at least moderately reflective of most animistic traditions around the world. Emphasizing that makes a whole lot more sense to me.
Also, I'm going to add on to that too. When you do emphasize that truism of animism, which is it's about relationality, it's about connection, it's about recognizing that your role in the world is as important, not more important, is as important as the tree, that you're communing with, or as important as the bees, or as important as wolves who are actually contributing to the economic, not economic, the ecological cycle of the area they're part of. And if it just acknowledging that, and just even gamifying, and I have mixed feelings about gamifying belief systems, but even gamifying that by including it in the way touchstones works helps people to understand what animism is outside of a lot of the new agey Ferngully Pocahontas versions that show up in Werewolf, and it gives it a lot more context that's a lot more meaningful.
Yeah,
100%.
Next is rules. I don't have a lot to say about at least the first part of rules. I do know that there are combat maneuvers that are missing from this book that are in Werewolf, in Vampire, which was probably a word count thing, but should have been included. And then we get to our forms. This has been done to death. I don't particularly like how the forms are done. This was trying to take something from Forsaken, but the difference is that Forsaken first, I think, stumbles. Forsaken second, I think, does it expertly, because the Uratha are not warriors, they're hunters. So they go through different stages of the hunt, and then the final killing blow, the all-out thing, shouldn't be on the whole time. And also their Krynos form, which is called Guru, just to muddle the issue, heals all non-aggravated damage per turn. So it's horrifying. This Krynos here is not horrifying. It's fine. I could get away with Hispo in most cases. It does aggravated damage with its bite attack too, and I just lose out on 2 dice. Any other thoughts from you two?
Just to say, mechanically, I find this boring. It's super boring. I am not interested in changing forms anymore. They just are super boring, and the fact that I can't have a clave, at least in Krynos, makes me kind of go, why then? Why would I use it? I actually don't honestly have a real strong reason as a character that I would go into Krynos form, and that seems strange.
I think that was intentional writing. I think that, especially when you look at how the clave is written in its own section, they're also giving that whole your previous generations use this, and obviously they were idiots, so why would you use it kind of attitude behind it. My one criticism that I've said a lot in private channels of the forum section is that wolves are not as easy to mistake for dogs as everyone wants to suggest they are. I do believe there is some credit to be given to the fact that if you just don't know shit and you're dumb as hell, maybe you might confuse them with a husky, even though huskies are fucking tiny compared to wolves. That said, one of the things that people are missing from that argument is that in Werewolf the Apocalypse, whatever version we're playing, we call it the Curse and Legacy versions, but in this version it still exists that humanity kind of instinctually knows that there's something awful and to fear from Guru. you're going to encounter this thing that maybe you think looks a little bit like a dog and then be overcome with like this uncomfortable dread because of the rage emanating from them. So I would think that at minimum, even if you didn't understand, you might be like, well, at least that's a dog that's rabid and going to attack me. But I honestly think the whole argument that like these look like wolves and are essentially the same size as wolves is absolutely nonsensical. People are using like fringe arguments to say that that's okay, and they always have. In Legacy editions, you had like people playing Bonars who look like pit bulls and stuff like that, but that just is not fit the theme and the setting, and it's just bad.
Yeah, and then it also, just with how the wolf form is written, what's the point of the merit of like hound lupus, where you look dog like in your lupus form? But if people already mistake you, then what's the point of the merit?
There's none.
Zero.
So
the other issue I have in these mechanics, Keegan, is the rage dice in general. I am going to mention playtesting just to say this. We playtested a couple of versions of these, right? Those were worse. Those were worse. This is better. It's still bad. I don't quite know why they didn't just use the exact same system as Hunger Dice in Vampire. While I would have been like, yeah, okay, you're just cutting and pasting, it probably would have been fine.
I would have actually preferred it if Rage acted more like Desperation Dice from Hunter. In that you can add up to 5, and then a 1 causes you to overreach or frenzy. That makes it more interesting. It lets you choose to channel your rage. But speaking of, because I've actually run this game, so this isn't just a shoot from the hip sort of discussion. People got frustrated because the shapeshifting, if you have 1 rage to shapeshift, you're going to feel like an idiot the second your rage die comes up a not success, because you lose that 1 rage, you have 1 turn potentially in your form, and then you're forced into Hammered or Lupus, and you feel like an idiot. It doesn't add drama, it just makes people mad.
It's a feel-bad mechanic.
Yeah. Yep. All right, let's see. Delirium, mostly unchanged. There's a lot of gifts and rights. Pick your favorite, and we can dissect the ones you need to dissect. Rights, I have a couple thoughts.
Wait, before we get into them, really quick comment on the chapter itself. I found it titillating when I read this book to see that Kareem was comfortable and able to capitalize native and native gifts, even though he was incapable of capitalizing native and Native American. That's just me being sassy. Go ahead, continue.
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to speak on 1 gift in the Arun section that it drives me fucking nuts.
That's fair. I just got a kick off of James's comment to say, why the fuck are they called native gifts?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense, right? There is no point in calling them that. That just is awkward. It doesn't fit any lore from this book at all. It just feels weird. Like, it feels like it's a poke. It's a poke at somebody, right?
Yeah. Silver Claws, though. Man, I do not like Silver Claws in this edition. For 1, you take 1 ag every turn, and you do ag to other Guru, but you can't hurt the precious vampires. Claws never do ag to vampires. That seems like a weird choice.
Here's my big issue with the gifts, just in general. They kept most of the names for the gifts, but some of them don't make any sense without the cultural context.
Yep, agreed. That is the biggest issue. The other issue is that they're tied to renown. So, once again, this is, and I'd mentioned this earlier, the Ghost Council are supposed to be the most, like, the ones who have the most interactions with spirits and things like that. But because their tribal renown is wisdom and all spirit summoning is based on honor, they're not. A Bone Gnar Thurge is better at communicating with spirits than a Ghost Council Thurge. And that's fucking wild.
Yeah. I want to talk about 1 gift. Ancestral Conviction. I don't get, again, without any ancestor spirits, like, it just seems like a silly gift. Like, it's fine. The gift is cool. But it just, why? Why is this a thing? Tell me something.
James, anything before we jump into rights? Because rights are a fucking mess.
And we've talked about it previously, but I just want to point out some specifics here. I'm not going to go through every example, but when you get to the Black Fury gifts, I'm just going to point out some names. Cursa Veolis, that's a cultural connection. Kali's scar, that's a cultural connection. Gorgon's visage, cultural connection. It just, and they're not the only ones, but like right away you can see it there.
Yeah. So rights, if you do it with more people, you potentially have the chance to be worse because they add rage dice to your pool, which is terrible.
Why?
Yeah.
Right.
Why?
Mechanically, why?
I think it's another example of the feel bad mechanics you're talking about. Like they're just basically discouraging you to work in bigger groups.
Yeah.
Yep. And saying that working in bigger groups is just a waste of time, right?
Because someone's going to get mad. Yeah, because someone will get mad.
Jeez.
Maybe if corporations could use rights, they would be more effective.
Exactly.
Maybe. Yeah, so I don't like the step sideways. The Rite of Shadows passage, I'm not a fan of. I feel like that should be just a default power of the guru.
See, I actually disagree. This is one of the few things in here so far that I can actually say I actually really like this.
Really?
I like the idea of stepping into the Umbra something that you have to do as a group, right? That you have to do as a group, that you have to work together to do, and then when you're there, you have to continue to work and be with each other to stay safe. I like that. I like the sense of like, this is what the pack is for. I kind of feel it's a little Forsaken-y, right? Where the pack is on the hunt and the hunt is this whole thing, right? But like going into the Umbra, I'm okay with it being more dangerous. I'm okay with that, and I'm okay with it emphasizing having your pack with you keeps you safe.
And I will say that I'm with you on that. I just think that it should be anyone should have this, and I think it should have been rewritten to be just a default Garu power because you're emphasizing you don't belong in either world. But if you bar anyone who doesn't have this right, you can have a whole group of Garu who never enter the Umbra because they don't have access to this right because no one thought about it and they keep forgetting about it with experience or something like that. And I think that's an issue.
I agree with both your takes, and the only criticism I'll give, like, I do agree about the idea of making the game focused around working together, because it should be what the game's about more than almost any other World of Darkness game, because you're in a pack and you're tied together with a spirit. It's extra. However, I think that would have been cooler in a book that wasn't antagonizing the idea of you entering the Umbra so much in the first place. It's like just an extra restriction on something that's already super hard and fucked up and punishing. On top of that, and I'm not gonna make too many arguments about the mechanics in this game. I think they fucked up this right by not talking about how you get back.
Yeah.
Yep. That's fair.
That is fair. Any other specific rights?
The art for the Rite of Cairn building, they clearly thought cairns, as in piles of rocks, were what a cairn in Werewolf is. It's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Spoiler.
I saw it too, and I laughed out loud when I saw it, and I was like, they sent this to the artist without giving them an explanation of what Karen means in the lore of the game.
I love it.
It's great.
No notes. Talismans. The only one I will say is, this was a discussion on a different Discord, is that the clave can be a talent talisman.
Unused clave is my favorite thing in this section.
Because it means it breaks into something.
Yeah, which means the first time you hit someone with it, it shatters.
Which means that there's embedded silver, which would, in theory, make it way more deadly than a regular clave.
Yeah, not by rules, but I see what you're saying. It's just, I don't know, it's just an example of trying to like add in this making everything talents thing that wasn't really thought through that well. And also, I know it's in a legacy thing, but they acknowledge it in the writing of this too, about how important it was as a social status symbol as well. Why would you make a one-use breakable thing that something that's like about your social status? It just doesn't make sense that they have that version.
Nope.
And then they make reference to the Silver Crown and belonging to Albrecht. The Albrecht lineage, specifically.
That is interesting to me, right? That is actually a story hook. If it was connected to the legacy of the game, then I'd be like, ooh, does that mean Albrecht had a kid? If Albrecht had a kid, who did he have that kid with? I am curious about that. But without it, got nothing.
Can you imagine if they got rid of the, like, I'm a FBI agent lore sheet and put in, like, I'm connected to the legacy of Albrecht sheet or something like that? It would have been a lore sheet. It would have been so much cooler.
That'd have been so fucking cool. Holy shit. Yeah. James, you're hired. Write me a werewolf book.
And then I'm fired.
The Karen
Okay.
system. Karens
Yep, here's
are
your Karen system. Yep.
Yep, Karens are treated basically like havens, which, while I'm not crazy about, I 100% get writing them like that in terms of if you're gonna make them a mechanic, the haven, making them like havens is not a bad way to do it. I think that's fine. I really have not a ton to say beyond that.
This is the first and only time in the entire book, and it gets 4 paragraphs, one of which is a sentence, that we talk about spirit guardians / spirit patrons of the Karens, which are, I guess we can just say that that's just not the case in this version, but in Legacy version was so important to why you were protecting a Karen.
Yeah.
Yep. Right now, there doesn't seem to actually be a reason, right? A strong reason to build and protect a Karen. It's just kind of like a thing. That just seems like a missing opportunity for 3 sentences.
Yeah. We're going to jump ahead 2 chapters because the next chapter is storytelling. I don't think there's much we can say on that because it's fine enough. That chapter is almost explicitly taste, right?
Also in my notes, the only thing I had that I wanted to say about this was how using Howgloss to break the Chronicle tenants was questionable, and that comes up here, but we already talked about it.
Yep.
Okay, and then we're now in the Umbra. The Umbra, there are aspects of this new Umbra I really like. The fact that it's volatile, that it changes based on emotions, the fact that some spirits are, completely irrational during things, or in that they don't see things as like someone with a human brain like a Garu would. Like, you step sideways after a disaster and a spirit's like, why did you let this happen? It's like, it didn't. Like, a car crash happens outside of your purview, and a car spirit's like, hey, motherfucker, I like that. There are certain aspects I really like about this, but the fact that it's damaging makes it punishing to explore this really interesting place they gave me.
I think my biggest struggle with it is I don't get a sense of what spirits are like, per se, in the Umbra now.
Mm-hmm.
I know we get a little bit of it in the allies and antagonists section, but I don't know. When I read this and I was really struggling to go, okay, well, what is it actually like, right? Is it the Umbra in Earthborn, the video game? I can run it that way, but it's not written in a way that I can at least reference that. Plus, that game is not canon, right? So I don't know. I don't know how I would present the Umbra if I were just to read this book. I would kind of struggle, and then of course, then I can be street level, right, and just stay in the city and fight vampires and have sex with them or whatever.
Fair. I mean, get you that necrophilia, Josh.
I'm just saying, they're setting all of that up. There's no antagonism between vampires and werewolves now, and they have a whole romance book for vampires coming out. I'm sure there'll be a section on werewolves getting along with them.
I remember clamoring for that book so hard. You can see a long history of why isn't there enough fucking in World of Dark?
Yeah.
The other thing is, and I know there's been some disagreements between us, is I don't like the Incarna are just wanting to be Celestians, like to get to the next rung of the hierarchy. I don't particularly like that. I think for some wanting to do that's fine and that's interesting, but all of them went to the V5 school of politicking now. Like, I just don't enjoy that. That's taste once again, but it's once again one of those Western like whiteifications of the setting, because the spirits, some compete, they're unique. The whole point is to kind of like be in some sort of harmony and balance, and the imbalance is what's causing issues. And they talk about that with like the worm, but if an Incarna does it to become a Celestian, it's cool now? That seems weird to me.
Yeah, there's not enough of the actual interactions and goals and desires of the patrons in the book to make it make sense. If they had a little section, and it wouldn't have to be huge, where it said, Patron Falcon wants this, X, Y, and Z. That's why they're getting their tribe together to do X, Y, and Z, and what they're hoping for in the Umbra, right? Cool. That tracks. But we don't have that. We don't have anything to go, this is what the patrons want or what they're trying to get. So it just doesn't jive, right? It doesn't connect.
Yeah.
So some side note / background knowledge on why I think you're seeing this disconnect. At least I think why. When the Hunters team was given our outline for what writing the book should look like, they actually forgot to mention patrons in the tribal sections. Like, it wasn't even mentioned. And we had to bring that up and be like, hey, what about this? But I do think that what you're seeing is potentially an artifact of that wasn't really just much of a consideration when they wrote this book.
That tracks. Yeah.
It
Actually,
does track.
to go back to the rights real quick, that's like that right of bonding a patron to the pack, right? All you get is that tribe's favor, I believe.
Yeah, another thing I would add to it in total is the fact that they don't give you any other example patrons but the tribal-based ones.
Yeah. I'm not a fan of that.
And they don't really give you a system for like making a patron or making a spirit, right?
There's nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Moving on, I guess, we can go to our allies and antagonists.
Oh, wait. If we're moving forward that far, I have 2 more things I want to say.
Okay.
Just short little things. One, when they're telling you how to tell a story and they invoke the 3-act structure, you're immediately, again, without realizing it, basing it in Western European storytelling structures.
Yep.
It's not culturally agnostic. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is this is actually one of the sections where there's a paragraph that is lifted almost entirely from the Hunter's Entertainment draft. And it's under Guy's demise, the Guru's inciting incident. It's the second paragraph in. It starts with, a silent strider may seek to regain a lost artifact in a desperate effort. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to mention, when I read this, I was like, oh, I know where that is, and found it. It's a little bit changed, but it's almost entirely lifted.
Good shit.
That's only have one thing to say about the allies and antagonists, so I will let you guys say what you want to say, and then I will say the one thing I want to say.
Okay, that might be a lot, but we'll see. One, I think the description of spirits materializing, I like. Actually, I think that's kind of cool. You're fighting a giant like truck monster because it's possessed by a bane. I think that's neat. The fact that because they're not guru, that they can't will material into the physical realm. They actually have to draw physical material to them. I kind of like, actually. I think that was a fine addition, and it's a nice little flavor thing, more so than anything else. And the other big thing is I'm actually pretty okay with Pentex getting a patron. I think that also is kind of fine. And
they're
then
a corporation, so maybe they can use that patron for good.
It's true.
There might be good parts of Pentex.
There might be other patron companies. Like you could have Paradox with the patron of Crusaders King, or yeah.
We all know Paradox is a company that's only doing good in this world and should absolutely be an exception. That's why we need to draw those lines and distinctions.
It is why they put the sidebar in. They didn't want to be associated with Pentex. Crazy talk. I like the Black Spiral Dancers not being necessarily completely irredeemable. Like them being like, no, this is just a natural process, and being real weird about it, and them still also being kind of, the atheist nihilists that the Red Talons are. But enough so to where they're like at least kind of redeemable, and they have a little bit of, it's at least a little interesting. And then the Cult of Fenris, I think we'll all have thoughts on, but because there's cultural references like Valhalla, also Fenris, and I've brought this up before. I'll bring it up right here, I guess. I think making their patron Wolf was a fucking mistake, because let's just assume I know nothing about Legacy. I'm just going into this book, right? And I'm reading the book, and the book's like, Guy is the most important. Guy is the most important. Luna's the second most important. But for some werewolves in the sidebar, Luna's the most important. Guy is the second most important. Okay. Who's the third most important? This world is very hierarchical. And in my brain, it's going to be Wolf. Obviously, Wolf. We're playing werewolves. And the book tries to do the cheeky, maybe Wolf fell, maybe Wolf has been taken, and the whole thing's being tricked. But then they basically say, no, it's because Wolf is the alpha, so they reinforce the alpha wolf thing. They don't say it alpha, but they say he brokers no dissent and has likely become a fanatic and fallen to Hogloss himself. And it's just like, so the third most important spirit to anyone who, because you haven't said otherwise, is the patron of the cult of Fenris. And that's fucking wild to me.
It's super wild.
I want to talk about Nazis. So I know that a lot of people, when I wrote my article about my experience working on this book, a lot of people misinterpreted what I was talking about to think that what I was saying was that the final version of this group was going to be the sort of Heimdall and pure Nazis, and the book was going to be all about Nazis. What I was saying was that that was the original desire of Kareem. And I think the reason that got pulled back so much in this version, you can attribute to our team, because he had to know going into the second version of this that he couldn't try to push that again because of how bad the pushback was, especially because, genuinely speaking, the author team on this book seems to have is almost entirely made up of marginalized folk, and so there's no way they wouldn't have said the same thing. That said, I'm urging everyone who reads this book who thinks, oh well, they pulled it back, they're not actually Nazis, they're not as bad as they were going to be, to read carefully how they are being described here. I want you to look carefully at the many, many times purity is being referenced in their write-up. I want you to remember that when we get to the section at the end where they talk about how to run fascism in the game, that they are explicitly referenced as being fascists. And we can argue about, like, well, actually they're fanatics, but like, can't they be both? Can't you be a fascist fanatic? Fanatics are the ones who are super focused on purity, right? So it's really what we're seeing is like, it's the original idea with a lot of the language baked out, but they couldn't bake it all out or didn't want to. It's there. You just need to read it carefully.
Yeah. I want to talk about the Cult of Fenris here in a minute, but I want to talk about Pentex first. Having Pentex be the first name all up in front and everything, I think, and I've said this for several years now, I think that's the wrong angle to take. I'm really frustrated that they did this, particularly because at one point I got told that they weren't going to do this, right? Pentex is a great, horrible, evil corporation in the back of things. They always have been, but people should not know the word Pentex. This section should be a whole group of worm-corrupted organizations with a single sidebar at the end going, rumors have it that the Pentex group owns all of these. End of story, right? The reason for that is that it allows you to use these in a much more natural and interesting way, that people will be like, oh, I didn't realize that the same company that makes my toothpaste, makes my macaroni and cheese, makes my gasoline, that makes my car, that makes the parts and blah, 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 because that's how fucking corporations work in the real goddamn world, right? They have their fucking paws and all kinds of shit, and you're like, wait, this particular like funding group owns like 70% of all of these different other corporations? What the fuck? I'm just saying you should dig into that, folks, if you're actually interested. If you've made it this far, do some research into your corporations, because it's fucking crazy the amount of certain parts of money that own large amounts of everything you do in your life.
I agree and disagree. I think there should be a section that does just talk about Pentex, because this is the antagonist section. This is meant for storytellers, and I think that you need to use very clear language, and so rumors of it being under this one company removes some of that clarity. If you want Pentex to be part of this, as it is, I think just having a clear, this is Pentex. I think Pentex is handled okay in this. I think that it's handled about as well in legacy things, quite frankly. I think this one actually handles certain aspects of Pentex better than legacy, actually, where they're just like, their name's not on anything. They don't have any corporate offices, really, anything. There's no Pentex logo. They don't reinforce, they don't contradict that, because that is written in legacy, but they don't contradict that with their art to talk about it. And then and they basically go, oh, did they?
There's a logo of Pentex Group on 268.
Yeah, on top of that, the French edition, if you back the French Kickstarter, you can get a version of the book where just it's white with the Pentex logo on the title instead of werewolf anything.
Fantastic. Make a liar out of me. Anyway, my point being really is that the one part that I really like that they handled is that it goes, Pentex doesn't actually care about its subsidiaries. or what it's holding. So if a werewolf fucks up that company too much, they just withdraw all their investments and invest elsewhere. And I think that was a great addition, and it's one of the few nods to this game that I think it did handle it very well.
Maybe. I think your take's valid. I just have a different take, and I think that's fine, right?
Yeah, it's just
I just want to add a quick addendum to the idea that Josh brought up of researching how a lot of these things work. Specifically, I would encourage, especially if you're a storyteller of this game and want to explore these themes, I would encourage you to research Nestle and look at how much stuff that they're involved in. Yep. And very specifically, I want you to look at their involvement in water rights, and I want you to look at the way that that's infecting indigenous communities.
100%. James, I think you said a lot of what I would have said about Cult of Fenris, but I want to add this. That if they wanted to have what do I want to add to this? Other than just my complete frustration, that yes, the Fenrir as written in Legacy are a problem. They're absolutely not a good example of anything you could say polite about Germanic and Scandinavian cultures, of things that you actually would want to exemplify. They don't, they're bad, even in Legacy. But having them tied to a culture allowed you to go, wait, I actually do know things about Scandinavian cultures and Germanic cultures and cultures descended from those places, and I can create characters that are actually interesting, that truly exemplify things that are actual cultural values of those people. Now you just have all of those words from Scandinavian culture with none of that context for making it make sense. I think it's incredibly insulting. And I think it's one of those things that I look at this and go, they thought because there were enough Scandinavians writing on this that they could write it like this and that it would be fine. And I don't think that's true. I actually think it's going, I don't know what it's doing, right? I just look at this and go, it goes against everything else you said that you wanted to do in this book. And it's like you're saying, hey, we're taking pot shots at ourselves, so that's cool. I don't know. Other than it's just lots of stuff out there that people have talked about it. I'm really not cool with it.
You know, you and I, in fact, all three of us, I think, see eye to eye on how they were handled. And so I don't know if there's I can't argue with you. I'm with you. I do want to add one thing, because we referenced it earlier in the podcast. The idea that when, I think it was Justin who said we had to remove them because we couldn't think of any verbs associated with them, like all the other tribes that made them unique. But not only was that not the reason that they were removed, because that was that came up much after it was out of the Hunters team's hand. I want to point out, in the way they wrote this section, they actually picked 3 great verbs that, even if you didn't make them antagonists, would have fit the tribe really well. And it's in the example characters. We have mocking, we have vindictive, and we have berserk. Those would have, you pick one more and you're there. You could have done it. I really don't like the ways in which Paradox and the team have really been very much see-through PR monsters and how they've handled this whole book.
Yep.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, if I was okay with the Fenrir falling to being fanatics for Gaia, because that was new. That was an interesting idea pitched like that they've become, it's all got to be for Gaia, because then you do create that uncomfortable antagonist who's supposed to be like you, but not. And then you create story seeds to redeem them. And that's what I thought was going to happen. There's lots of stuff online showing me defending the Fenrir becoming the tribe fallen to Hogloss. And I stand by that initial, they fell to fanaticism to Gaia. That'd be interesting. It's new. Because then you could have played with the White Howlers fell to the Worm and became the Black Spiral Dancers. The Glasswalkers fell to the Weaver and became the Cyber Dogs. And the Get of Fenris fell to Gaia. That's interesting. Just straight up interesting, I feel. And it creates different layers of antagonists and reinforces those themes of things needing to be in balance, even Gaia.
I think there's cool stories you could go there with it. Yeah, I think there would have been things to do with that, but I also think this is a tribe that had explicitly gotten rid of those elements, right? James talks about that in their posts, right? Like, this is the tribe that had excised those particularly bad elements, right? The swords of Heimdall, they had destroyed them because they knew that way leads to the worm.
I just want to add to it, they also thought it was weak. They thought they were weak because they thought that, because it's a tribe that does believe in like might makes right, for better or worse. But they thought that by placing the concepts of might in what your identity was, like saying that women couldn't be mighty, that queer folk couldn't be mighty, that, you know, disabled people couldn't be mighty, that brown people couldn't be mighty, made them weaker. And so they also wanted to remove them because they actually saw it as a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which, that's actually kind of interesting, right? Like, that's you're still in the wrong, but like, at least you're not super wrong, right? Like, you're wrong in a different way. I don't know.
This how they were handled versus how we thought they might be handled, except for James, because they were obviously on the front lines, is that we thought that they were going to actually stay true to their we will confront difficult issues, and this is just the coward's way out, I think.
Ironically, because the original Fenrir would have slaughtered you for taking the coward's way out.
Sure would have. Stargazers, just like before, what do they want? No one knows. They're mysterious. We're tied to Chimera. They still don't want to talk to you for reasons.
For reasons. James mentioned the Stolen Moons before. Do you want to dig into them? Because I think these are cool. I actually think this is one of the cooler things out of this.
I think they're cool too. That's all I have to say.
I mean, your influence is all
definitely
over
a fan.
Yeah.
No, the imperfect Garu aspect of them now is really cool. They're almost like a hybrid between the former editions version and the Werewolves.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty cool.
Yep. These would be an enemy I would use, right? I would steal this idea and use it in a different. One other antagonist thing, I lied saying I had nothing else because I forgot this whole section was here. I like that the Raven Shifters and Spider Shifters get a mention, at least.
Yeah.
Because at one point I'm aware that we weren't going to get any Pharaoh references at all.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring them up because, I like the Korax. The Spiders was an interesting choice. That wouldn't have been my first choice as an additional changer, but...
Yeah, I feel like Bastet probably deserve a mention before... I should say cat shifters before spider shifters.
Yeah.
Because of the role they have. But again, I think our heads are in legacy. We think about the importance of the whole story.
No, that's fair.
Maybe this version, the spider shifters are carrying a lot more importance compared to the cat shifters. Who knows? Yeah,
that's very true. I want to talk about a slight annoyance. The supernaturally attuned vampires. Vampires get 1, 2, like almost 3 pages, it feels like, of stuff. Oh no, sorry, the magician's there. But we have a huge chunk of just vampire stuff, and then just aggrandizing vampires in a side panel. It's just, it's very obvious this book was written by vampire players who wanted to make more vampire in their werewolf.
I think that's, you can see that throughout the whole book and not just this section.
That's true.
And I actually have a compliment for this section, but it still reinforces what you're saying. I genuinely think some of the best writing in the whole book is in these 2.5 pages. Yeah, I'm really impressed with the voice behind it. The voice is really good, and I find it very compelling. But I also think that reinforces what you're saying, because it's true that the perspective going into this was vampire-centric. It was from at least in the beginning, a vampire fan who did not care for Werewolf and kind of wanted to diminish Werewolf in comparison to Vampire because he kind of saw werewolves as just being like something that made his vampire games less fun for him. And so while I agree with you and I'm not countering you at all, I also think that the result of that is the best writing in the book is in the vampire section.
No, that's fair. And that's totally valid.
I think it's extended throughout the antagonist section, though. Actually, like most of this antagonist section, I think is really well written.
I'm sure it was the same author, yeah. But I think I agree with you. The whole section is really well written, but I think the 2 vampire entries stand above the rest of the good writing.
That's fair. That's fair.
Lore
Count
sheets.
fucking Orlocker shit is a good, or some shit is a good headline, right?
It's such
Fair.
a great, like, frustrated werewolf statement.
Lore sheets. We've got the monkey wrenchers.
Well, I have monkey wrenchers anymore, but okay, sure, monkey wrenchers.
Project Twilight. Gotta get that legacy and possibly Second Inquisition connection. Umbral Traveler. This lore sheet's required if you want to do any kind of extensive Umbral travel at all. If the Umbra is going to be a big thing in your game, you're probably going to want this lore sheet, unfortunately, which feels weird. It feels just out of place. And I'm just kind of rocketing through these. If you guys have thoughts, please.
One just quick thought about people house ruling the game to make it a little bit easier to play and less punishing. I just toss out here that I would give all your players everything on this sheet just to make the game a lot more fun and you can do a lot more things with the Umbra without feeling like you're getting shat on. And the truth is, you still kind of are. Like, this makes it easier to deal with, but doesn't remove the difficulties.
Yep.
Yeah, no, that's true.
My main thought here is the core Vampire book had many more lore sheets, didn't it? Or am I misremembering that?
No,
Okay.
you're true. I think this book suffers. And older editions of Werewolf have also suffered from the fact that the Umbra and the spiritual aspect takes up so much word count. They drop things. Like, they dropped a lot of combat things, and I think someone who ordered the book told me that they got a separate PDF that had, like, the couple missing combat things with their order. And
minor actions entirely.
Yeah, exactly. So there's just a ton of stuff just missing from this book to fit the Umbral stuff in, and as you said, Josh, there are places where the word count was certainly misplaced to not reinforce the game itself. Well, like what James said, even if the vampire stuff is the best writing in the book, it is taking things away from the werewolf experience.
Particularly because then you have this adventure at the end, which, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Vampire Core doesn't have an adventure in the book, right? Or does it?
I would have to check.
Yeah.
No, what they have instead is they have the example play comic book.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of supposed to take place, because that's kind of what adventures are for anyway. They're like giving you a taste of the basics of the game. And so they just have that instead.
Okay. I make note of that because, like, this to me is fine. Like, as James is saying, if you use it as an example of play, okay, I get that. But also, that to me is all word count. That would be better spent making this a separate PDF download that you have immediately available that you sell for $1.99 and give me these pages with actual useful things.
Yes.
Mage 20th did that with the Mage Quick Start, which gave you a bunch of sample characters and an adventure, and basically were like, here, learn how to play the game. And I don't remember how much it was, but I want to say it was less than $6 probably.
Yep.
So I'm just going to go back to the lore sheets real quick. You've got the Renunciated Fenris, where you were a former cult of Fenris and left before the big fallout, and just bootlicker. Like, even among werewolves, they had a reputation of basically being strongman leaders, which is that is reinforcing the fascism.
Yep.
I just wanted to call that out, that they follow strongman leaders. And then the Black Spiral one, which is, once again, 5 dots, solving the labyrinth, where you can, once per story, pull a Black Spiral aside, isolate him from his friends and family, and then slowly deprogram him into being a guy in Garu.
These are not the lore sheets I would have put in my version of Werewolf, right?
Yeah.
I should have brought it up before, but I just thought of it now because I was reading the Black Spiral Dancer lore sheet. And I want to talk about the change of their tribal patron to Bat from Legacy Whippoorwill. I don't think that this was an intentional choice based off of this. But one thing that gets missed, and I use as an example of how much of Legacy Werewolf, and it's made it into this edition, is based in a lot of indigenous belief systems, is that the reason that a lot of people are like, well, so I heard someone say something like, oh yeah, they probably got rid of Whippoorwill as the Black Spiral Dancer patron because who's afraid of a bird? Like, it's just a bird. Bat's way scarier. And I'm like, what you don't understand about Whippoorwill is that to a lot of different indigenous tribes that were living on the East Coast, Whippoorwill was an omen of death. The call that bird makes was essentially like a sign that death was coming. And so it was something to be feared and avoided. And again, like that gets, we can talk about exactly where the authors pulled it from. It might, like, Lovecraft picked up that idea, right? And so maybe the authors got it from Lovecraft, because the original writers of the first edition Werewolf did mention Lovecraft as an inspiration.
Yep.
But even if they got it from Lovecraft got it from indigenous stories about how to live and how to protect your communities. And so it's just I could really go into like hundreds of examples in this game, in Legacy editions and this one, where there's indigenous belief systems built into it and people don't realize it. And by popping out Whippoorwill for Bat, I don't think they did it for that reason. I think they literally probably did do it because they're like, well, why is Whippoorwill there? That's not scary. Let's pick something creepier. But even then, like, it's another example of just like people missing how much indigeneity is baked into this game at its core.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip the intro adventure because I didn't read it.
I haven't either. I skimmed it. Okay.
I did, and I don't want to go too deep into it because I don't know if it's the most interesting part of the book, but I do want to say I do think it wasn't written very well, and I think that was particularly with balance in mind. The last enemy you fight is stronger than individual members of your pack, and because of that, even if your whole and there's nothing else to fight but that enemy. And because of that, if your pack like goes as you would expect into Krynos at the big bad culmination fight scene, they're all going to lose it really fast because there's nothing to kill but that enemy. And then once they're out of Krynos, that thing is so powerful, it's just going to beat the shit out of your Glabro or Hispo forms. It's stronger than your Krynos forms. It's really strong. And so I feel like if you're going to run this adventure, you need to add in like maybe some minor Bane Jaglings or something, or Gathlings, I should say, not Jaglings. For your characters to kill while they're killing it, just so that they don't lose their Krynos form, because if they don't, they're going to get murdered by this thing.
Good call.
That's an example of the mechanics not actually fitting the fiction that they're building.
On top of that, you don't directly deal with the cult of Fenris, but you do deal with two quote-unquote human members of it. They're obviously kinfolk, but they can't have kinfolk anymore, who basically like show up and are like kind of like backcountry hicks in the way they're represented, which I think is just yet again another nod to who they're saying this community is. Not that I think this is a totally fair comparison, because it's way more complex and nuanced than this, but there is absolutely, in the US at least, the association with uneducated kind of backcountry white folk as being associated with white supremacy and racism. And so it's there if you look. And also, why are there human members of the cult of Fenris?
Yeah.
Right.
Also, wildly classist.
Yes.
Definitely. That's kind of what I meant about it being nuanced, because the worst elements of white supremacy are absolutely capitalist rich people.
Oh, yeah. So, considerations for play, with our favorite fascism in play, but unless you have things to add about character or sex and romance, they found a way to work breeding in, just not in the way we expected.
I am going to give them this. They largely removed breeding as a thing. I actually don't even think they use the word breeding in this entire book.
Yep.
And I have to say, thank you. Golf clap for that. I am impressed. This is the first Werewolf book not to do that, but you fucked everything else up. So you get your one golf clap.
Let me argue against you, because I'm here to be LOL, a devil's advocate against the white people in the room. I'm kidding, by the way, but hello, can we acknowledge that the removal of breeding and being able to stay in Krynos form in this is purely just kink shaming?
Yes.
That's all it is. It's just kink shaming. And you know what? I don't want to yuck anyone's yum. If you want to fucking Krynos, and if you want to have your little, like, please breed me daddy kink, like, play it in Werewolf. That's what's good for you. Why not? This is another one that's going to be quoted out of context a lot.
Yes. I think this is the best one to be quoted out of context for, quite frankly. Like, we could. I did this joke with one of my other plays. We could trim that one off, and we could make a page OnlyFans to hear James talk about "Yes, Daddy, breed."
Just when you do the editing, you know how sometimes people will pick like one quote from the whole podcast and just put it at the beginning, and then let you find out where it is. Just pick that one. Just pop it right in the front and be like, "Here's what you're getting into, everybody."
Oh Jesus! Oh, I am far too lazy to do that.
Here's the thing, though, with that, actually, that I actually want to say this kind of seriously, right? If you are a furry, and I am not, but I love you anyway. If you're a furry, the writers of this game, or at least several people involved, don't like you. because they were intentionally don't put abs on our werewolves, don't make them sexy, don't do X, Y, and Z, right? Like, they're trying to de-emphasize the fact that there is a strong furry community that did like and appreciate Werewolf the Apocalypse, and it's all other themes, right? It wasn't just the furry thing for them, but that is pretty much removed. So that's the thing you've got to deal with if you are coming into this as a fan of previous editions. Because of that, you don't got it here at all.
Yeah.
I have a direct quote somewhere that I could find of a certain someone saying, "We are not here to cater to the furry community."
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I do want to talk about this one. This might be the last point to make, simply because it is the one that is the most infuriating, which is, of course, fascism in play. And I might be misreading this, but to me it certainly feels like it tries to both sides fascism. No matter how many in the intro, Nazis don't play this game, if you're part of the alt-right fuck-offs, this is such a nod to that I don't like it. It was either really thoughtless or really poorly worded or very intentional.
There's a part here that I think is appropriate that I'd like to read out if I could.
Oh, I was just gonna read the whole section just because I think it's.
If you want to. Okay.
Yeah. That might be the best way. So, fascism. Werewolf is not a fascist-friendly game. Because it's a horror game about contemporary issues, it can be a game where fascism as a theme or fascism as characters show up. After all, they're an unfortunate part of the real world we inhabit. In the simplest terms, you can use Nazi of whatever stripe seems most appropriate for your setting as enemies. After all, who doesn't want to go full Wolfenstein every now and then? In Werewolf, you can confront the problems of the world and rip their face off. Nazis are certainly a problem. As with all other potentially difficult themes, participants can have wildly different reactions and wishes regarding fascism depending on their personality and background. For some, Nazis are cartoonish enemies to be ripped in half. For others, they're a clear and present danger, the people who are calling for them to be eradicated. This is another topic you may wish to discuss during your session 0, especially if it's expected that fascists or fascism plays a significant part in the chronicle. What are the player's specific comfort levels with the subject? Remember that people are highly individual. One player whose life has been impacted by fascism may not wish to see them in the game, while another with similar experiences enjoys blasting them to bits. Note that in Werewolf, themes of fascism may be presented in the social realm of the player's characters. A friend goes over to the cult of Fenris, seduced by their message of simple-minded morality. A player may decide to explore the themes of eco-fascism in their own character by skirting close to Hogloss. These situations create opportunities to grapple with fascism with more nuance than as simple enemies. How do you bring back a friend who has gone over to a hateful ideology? How do you avoid succumbing to bitterness and desperation and the simple answers provided by a charismatic demagogue? So, I just want to say on the surface, the first 3 paragraphs are fine, actually. I think everything up until the last paragraph starts to where it loses me, where it's just like, hey, be considerate of people's experiences with this. Individualistic, fuck Nazis. But then to the last paragraph of the nuances of fascism, even if that is not what you intended, that's not a great thing to say.
I actually have a problem with the third paragraph, too, where it says, for some, Nazis are cartoonish enemies to be ripped in half, and for others, they're a clear and present danger. No, they are a clear and present danger now to everyone. If you don't recognize that fascists in the world today, pretty much everywhere, are a clear and present danger, you're not paying attention. And to kind of say, oh, to some people, they're cartoonish monsters, it's not 1994 anymore where you could say that and people didn't realize that there was a rising. fascist movement starting, moving from earlier eras too, but like continuing, right, and building.
So
right? People didn't know that.
So this is probably more grace than this section deserves, but it's specifically talking about Nazis, which is like all Nazis are fascists, but not all fascists are Nazis, and
Fair.
and that might be way more grace than this book deserves, like realistically. But I do want to point out that might be something that they were thinking. I don't know who wrote this. They might have had that specific idea in mind, because there's been times even on Onyx Path, right, when they did adventure, it was like punching Nazis is fun, and pulp action fiction things. That is certainly how some people view Nazism specifically. They might not view MAGA fascists that way, or even Bolsonaro fascists for our few Brazilian listeners. They're not because those are more clear present dangers to their very lives than
than your stereotypical 1940s
40s, yeah,
Nazi.
Exactly.
I will say I acknowledge that, but I also think we are no longer in a world where we can say, oh, you can't just call all your enemies Nazis. I think enough of the fascists in society now would not just be Nazis, but would be worse than Nazis, right? Like, they want every bad thing there. So that's just my opinion. I think the wording here is just quibbly rather than...
Fair enough. And I acknowledge that. Like I said, that was my attempt at grace, because sometimes that is still a predominant view, especially even in a lot of liberal circles, right?
Yeah.
So
the other problem here, though, is that Hoglosk is fascism, right? The way it is written, right? I know there's two different versions of it, right? But like, if you're going off that first section, right? Like, I don't know how it's not. And so I don't know how you have it be present in the game as a mechanic without that theme always being there. And so this is disingenuous in saying you can avoid this theme. I don't think you can, right?
No, that's fair. No, I agree with that, especially because it directly parallels Hogloss to fascism in this section. So
right.
Hogloss as fascism seems like the true interpretation, given that that's referenced twice and the fanaticism is mostly referenced once.
Yep. Those are all my thoughts there.
So you all covered most of what I want to say about this section, so I don't need to repeat any of it. I'm kind of in the same vein with your thinking. I just want to add a little bit to one of the thoughts there, being that clownifying Nazis and strongman dictators is actually a white supremacist tactic to make them more acceptable. It's part of the reason why Trump and Bolsonaro are so popular, is because there was so much like, well, you can't take them seriously because they're just dumb clowns, but they're more than dumb clowns. And so the whole like cartoonish Nazi reference here is honestly kind of a little bit of a Nazi dog whistle. Maybe they didn't mean that, but it is. The other thing I want to add here, especially because you talked about how them tying the concepts of fascism and, because of the way they wrote this, Nazism into Howglosk, which is something your player characters will encounter and potentially have to have become part of their character, reinforces the fear that the original Hunters Entertainment team brought to Kareem when we were being asked to write the Swords of Heimdall in as the primary antagonists, which was we were concerned that by doing so, especially to a group, the Geta Fenris, which is historically one of the more popular tribes in the game, we would be creating a player's guide to playing a fascist or a Nazi. And I don't think that... My charitable version is I don't think that was necessarily the intention here. I don't know. I have misgivings. But unfortunately, what this does is, because this section is a player's guide for how the storyteller should run Nazis, but because of Howglosk and this being what Howglosk is in the setting, you're also telling the players, here's how you should roleplay your characters as you descend through Howglosk. Here's how you should become fascist. Here's how you should become Nazis, which is exactly what we said was going to happen. And that's what this section is. It's a player's guide to playing Nazis.
Yeah, 100%. I'm laughing because I don't want to scream, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, I'm going to quote, I don't know who I'm quoting. It might be Nightingale from the Onyx Path forums. But in the beginning, Kareem Umar wanted to genocide younger brother, the primarily Native American tribe from the game, while also centering fascist Nazis as some of the main antagonistic elements that were used to be good guys. And although it didn't come out the way that the original proposal was suggested, he got through a different way. He got what he wanted. There's no more indigenous stuff in this game. There's nothing about what it's like to be a colonized people, and there's nothing about like environmental racism. I think there's one mention in the Pentext paragraph about environmental racism, and also it suggests it puts Native Americans in a victim role, not people who fight back, which is one of the strengths of Younger Brother. By the way, the Gale Stalkers, the Winter's Teeth. One of my favorite things about them was you got to be indigenous people who were capable of fighting back. Not that we aren't normally, but like you got to like put that power in your hands and rip things apart, and it was fucking cool. And those things are removed from the game, but we still have this 3 or 4 or 5 paragraph section that's here's how you're going to play your Nazi characters.
So, as we on that note, if you love this game and you've listened this far, and you've given us the grace to try to just hear our opinions, and you see the flaws, but you still like this game, thank you for listening. Honestly, we really appreciate it, or at least I know I do. But it's just important, and it's, as I said earlier, it's important to be critical of the media that you love. I am very critical of Werewolf. I'm very critical of Exalted, which is another child of mine. I'm very critical of D&D and all of its previous editions, but I still love them. And you can be critical of this game, you can be critical of Paradox, and you can still love Werewolf 5th. If Werewolf 5th is your first Werewolf game and you're able to avoid these themes, or now that you're aware of them, now sidestep them and insert your own hope and things like that, then go off, and I hope you have fun. With that, though, Josh, where can folks find you if you want to be found?
Wow, I'm not sure I want to be found after this conversation, but if you'd like to follow me anywhere, I recommend going to highlevelgames.ca. The company is Canadian, I'm sorry, but you can find all kinds of books that we have produced on there. We have a game that is coming out called Army Men. If you're interested in playing plastic people in a world full of plastic people and beings who are trying to figure out, am I plastic, or is my gun plastic, or is it made of flesh? I don't know. All those kind of creepy, cool questions. You can do that with Army Men. So that's my pitch.
Perfect. And James, same question to you. If you want to be found, where can folks find you?
Oh, they seem to be really good at finding me. So on most social media, I'm Indigidroid. If that's confusing about how to spell, it's like indigenous with the nis taken off and droid instead. On top of that, you can find my Patreon at JF Sambrano. And I'm also I kind of show up other places as JF Sambrano too, so it'd be hard for me to list them all off. Patreon's where I talk the most about what I'm writing and role-playing games and things like that, so you don't have to, in fact, I don't even encourage it, but you do not have to give me money to go read my Patreon. You can just follow it and you'll get email updates when I post, and you should do that because I like to have conversations there. But yeah, send me all the hate mail you want about this episode. I'm looking forward to it.
On a positive note, James helped write the Transformers game. Go buy that, and then tell Renegade how much James's writing has improved that game.
Tell him to bring me back. I want to write more Transformers books.
Fuck yeah.
Fuck yes.
All right, and with that, I'm Keegan. This was A Bunch of Gamers. We're on YouTube, Podbeam, and several other places. I am on Facebook under A Bunch of Gamers, but you will never find me on Twitter or X now, because I always found it a cesspool, and I was right.